Imagine being trapped in a monster's cave, the air thick with the smell of blood, knowing you could be its next meal. Imagine having to stab out the single eye of a giant, one-eyed monster, a son of a god, just to escape. This is just one moment from the life of a legendary figure. A king whose cunning was his shield and sword, a man who stared down gods and monsters and lived to tell the tale. Tonight, we plunge into an epic suffering and survival, where the fury of a god once again shapes the destiny of a man. This isn't just a regular story. It's a testament to unbreakable will, a journey through nightmares, and a desperate fight for home. This is a story of Odysseus. Before the Great War, before the monsters in the endless ocean, Odysseus was simply the king of a small, rocky island called Ithaca. This wasn't a rich, grand kingdom like Mycenae or Sparta. No, Ithaca was rugged with tall, rough mountains and quiet, hidden bays. It was a place for hard-working people, fishermen, and farmers who coaxed life from the stubborn soil. Ithaca sat far out in the Ionian Sea, west of mainland Greece. It was a place known for its beauty, but also for its wildness. Being surrounded by so much water meant it was often cut off from the rest of the world. This made the people of Ithaca strong and independent, and their king, Odysseus, was no different. He loved his home deeply, every rock and every wave. He felt its isolation, but also its peace. In his royal palace, which was grand enough for a king but still felt like home, Odysseus lived with his family. His father was Laertes, a wise and gentle old king who had given up the throne to his son. Laertes was often found working in his vineyards, still strong even in his old age, preferring the quiet life of a farmer to the duties of a ruler. His mother was Anaclea, a loving and caring queen who kept the household running smoothly. She was a kind presence, always there for Odysseus, offering comfort and good advice. Their family life was simple, yet full of warmth and respect. It was a life Odysseus treasured, a foundation of peace he would dream of during his long, hard journey. But Odysseus wasn't just a king by birth. He was known throughout Greece for something special: his mind. Unlike other heroes who were famous for their great strength, like the mighty Ajax, or their unstoppable fighting skills, like Achilles, Odysseus was known for his cleverness. He was smart, quick-thinking, and often found ways to win not by brute force, but by outsmarting his enemies. This made him both respected and, sometimes, a little feared. People called him Wily Odysseus, or Odysseus of many tricks. Some old stories even whispered that his true father wasn't Laertes, but Sisyphus, a legendary king known for his extreme cunning and trickery. While most believed Laertes was his father, this rumor showed just how much Odysseus' smarts stood out. He was like a master chess player, always thinking many moves ahead. Even from a young age, Odysseus showed this sharp wit. He could solve problems others couldn't, and he was a master of words, able to persuade people or talk his way out of trouble. This special gift would prove to be his greatest weapon, far more useful than any sword or shield, especially when faced with challenges no ordinary warrior could overcome. This unique mind, born from the quiet wisdom of Ithaca, would soon be tested in ways no one could imagine. The peace of his island kingdom and the simple joy of his family were about to be shattered by the call of the Great War, a war that would drag him away from home and lead him into a life-changing adventure. Before the Great War, before the wandering, Odysseus' life changed forever when he met the woman who would become his queen, Penelope. She was a beautiful princess from Sparta, known not just for her looks, but for her quiet wisdom and intelligence, a match for Odysseus' own sharp mind. Many princes and kings from all over Greece wanted to marry Penelope. Her father, King Icarius, had a problem: how to choose a husband without making all the other powerful suitors angry. If he picked one, the others might wage war. So Odysseus, ever the problem solver, came up with a clever plan. He told Icarius to make all the suitors swear an oath. This oath was a promise that they would accept whoever Penelope chose, and more importantly, they would all come to the aid of her husband if anyone ever tried to harm him or take his wife. This clever trick meant that no matter who Penelope picked, the other suitors would be bound to protect her and her new husband, not fight against him. The suitors, eager for prize, agreed to this oath. Then came Penelope's choice. With all eyes on her, she chose Odysseus. Perhaps it was his intelligence, his quiet confidence, or the way he moved and spoke, but she saw something special in him. Their marriage was not just about power or alliances. It was a bond built on respect and understanding. Soon after their marriage, the palace in Ithaca was filled with joy at the birth of their son, Telemachus. The name meant fighter from afar, a fitting name for a child whose father would indeed be far away, fighting for many years. Telemachus was the light of their lives, a symbol of their love and the future of Ithaca. Odysseus deeply cherished his son, teaching him and watching him grow. He dreamed of raising Telemachus to be a strong and wise king, just like himself. But even in these happy times, there was a shadow of fate. An old prophecy had been whispered that Odysseus would be gone from his home for many years, a very long time indeed. This seemed impossible to the young king, happy in his palace with his new family. He could not imagine what could pull him away for so long. He built a life he loved in Ithaca, a peaceful existence with his beloved Penelope and their young son, Telemachus. He had his wise father, his kind mother, and a loyal kingdom. He truly believed he would live out his days there, ruling justly and watching his son grow into a man. But the gods and the whims of powerful men had other plans. A great conflict was brewing far away, a conflict that would demand the presence of every powerful hero in Greece, including the clever king of Ithaca. The peaceful life Odysseus knew was about to be shattered, and his long, cruel journey was about to begin. The quiet peace of Ithaca shattered like glass when news of a terrible event reached its shores. Helen, the most beautiful woman in the world, wife of King Menelaus of Sparta, had run away with Paris, a prince from the great city of Troy. This wasn't just a simple love story gone wrong. It was an insult, a betrayal that shamed Menelaus and all of Greece. His older brother, Agamemnon, the mighty king of Mycenae, vowed to gather all the Greek kings and their armies to sail to Troy and bring Helen back, by force if necessary. This was the start of the Trojan War, a conflict that would last 10 long years and change the lives of everyone involved. Every hero, every king who had once sworn an oath to protect Helen's marriage, remember that clever oath Odysseus himself helped set up for Penelope's hand, was now called upon. They were bound by their word to join Agamemnon. The most famous warriors of Greece began to gather. The mighty Achilles, the strongest of them all, the giant Ajax, the wise Nestor, and many more. But one king, known for his cunning, was not eager to join this cause. That king was Odysseus. Odysseus loved his home, his wife Penelope, and his young son Telemachus more than anything. He saw the war as a pointless waste of life, a long and bloody conflict over one woman. He knew the prophecy whispered about his long absence if he went to Troy, and he did not want to leave his family or his peaceful island. So he decided to try a clever trick to avoid going to war. When the envoys, including the cunning Palamedes and the wise Nestor, arrived in Ithaca to call him arms, they found Odysseus acting very strangely. He had put on a peasant's cap, not his royal crown, and was plowing his fields. But he wasn't plowing with oxen. He had yoked an ox and a donkey together, which was a ridiculous sight and would never work properly. Even stranger, as he plowed, he began throwing salt into the furrows instead of seeds. This was a clear sign of madness in ancient times, as salt would ruin the soil. Odysseus wanted everyone to think he had lost his mind and was unfit for war. He looked wild, his eyes seemed distant, and he mumbled nonsense as he worked. He was giving the performance of a lifetime, hoping they would simply leave him behind. Palamedes, however, was as cunning as Odysseus, and he saw through the act. He suspected that Odysseus, known for his intelligence, was faking his madness. Palamedes decided to test him in a cruel way. As Odysseus plowed, Palamedes snatched the infant Telemachus from Penelope's arms and placed the tiny baby directly in the path of the plow. Odysseus's cleverness was instantly broken by his love for his son. Without thinking, he immediately stopped the plow, pulling it sharply aside to avoid harming Telemachus. The act was quick, instinctive, and completely revealed that he was sane. A madman would not have cared for the child. Palamedes smiled sadly. The trick had failed. Odysseus was exposed. He scooped up his son, holding him tight, knowing that his clever plan had come to an end. He could no longer refuse the call to war. his heart heavy. He agreed to join the Greek forces, knowing he was stepping into a destiny that would take him far from home. Though he was forced to go, Odysseus embraced his role. His clever mind and ability to speak made him a valuable leader even before the ship sailed for Troy. He wasn't just a fighter. He was a problem solver, a diplomat, and a strategist. One of his first tasks was to help gather the other Greek heroes. The mighty Achilles, the greatest warrior of all, was hiding on the island of Scyros, disguised as a girl among the daughters of King Lycomedes. His mother, the sea goddess Thetis, knew a prophecy said Achilles would die at Troy, so she tried to keep him away. It was Odysseus, along with the cunning Diomedes, who tricked Achilles into revealing himself. They brought gifts to the court, including women's jewelry and clothes, but also a sword and a shield. When a trumpet suddenly blared, Achilles instinctively grabbed the weapons, exposing his true identity. With Achilles found, the Greek army was almost complete. Odysseus also used his wisdom to settle arguments and bring different kings together. There were many strong-willed leaders, each with their own ideas and pride. Odysseus often acted as a voice of reason, finding common ground and helping to unite them under Agamemnon's leadership. He understood how important it was for the vast Greek army, made up of men from many different lands, to work as one. His reputation grew as a man who could lead not just with a sword, but with words and wit. He helped organize a massive fleet of ships, gathered supplies, and made sure the heroes who were often quick to anger were brought into line. He was the glue that held the often clashing personalities of the Greek leaders together, ensuring that their shared goal, the return of Helen, remained their focus. As the thousands of ships began to gather in Aeolus, a port in central Greece, Odysseus stood among the other kings, his heart a mixture of duty and sorrow. He looked back at the shores of Ithaca, now fading in the distance, knowing that he might not see them again for a very long time. The great adventure, the war that would test his cleverness and his very spirit, was about to begin. The Greek army was vast, 1,000 ships and tens of thousands of warriors, all gathered at Aeolus, ready to sail to Troy. But a strange calm fell over the sea. No winds blew, the sails hung limp, and the ships couldn't move. Day after day, week after week, the mighty army waited, growing restless and angry. It seemed the gods themselves were against them. The great prophet Calchas was called upon to understand this divine anger. He revealed a terrible truth. The goddess Artemis was furious. Agamemnon, the commander of the Greek forces, had offended her, either by boasting about his hunting skills or by harming one of her sacred animals. To calm her wrath and gain favorable winds, Artemis demanded a horrifying sacrifice, Agamemnon's own daughter, Iphigenia. This was a cruel choice. Agamemnon was torn between his love for his daughter and his duty to the army. Odysseus, with his sharp mind, played a difficult role here. He was among the leaders who had to convince Agamemnon that this terrible act was necessary for the entire expedition to succeed. It was a dark moment, a sign of the immense sacrifices that would be demanded by this war. In the end, Agamemnon made the agonizing decision. Iphigenia was brought to Aeolus on the false pretense of marrying Achilles, and there she was sacrificed. Only then did the winds finally stir, filling the sails and allowing the massive fleet to set off for Troy. The journey across the Aegean Sea was long, but finally the shores of Troy appeared. A prophecy had long foretold that the first Greek warrior to set foot on Trojan soil would be the first to die. This made every man hesitate, fearing to be the one to fulfill such a grim fate. But one hero, Protesilaus, bravely leaped from his ship, knowingly sacrificing himself to break the curse and allow the rest of the army to land. He died quickly, but his courage opened the way for the Greeks. Thousands of warriors poured onto beaches, establishing their camp. It was a massive undertaking, creating a temporary city outside the mighty walls of Troy. They dug trenches, built defenses, and set up their tents. This would be their home for the next 10 years. The first 9 years of the Trojan War were a long, grinding struggle. It wasn't a constant, epic battle every day. Instead, it was a mix of fierce battles on the plains outside the city, smaller raids into the surrounding towns to gather supplies and weaken Troy, and long periods of quiet waiting. The Greeks tried to take the city by storm many times, but the walls of Troy were too strong, its defenders too brave, led by the noble Hector and his valiant brothers. During these long years, Odysseus was not just a warrior. He was a leader, a negotiator, and a spy. He was constantly thinking, always looking for an advantage. He led scouting parties, sneaking out at night to gather information about the Trojan movements. He was part of many raiding groups, helping to attack smaller towns allied with Troy, bringing back food and treasure to the Greek camp. His words were often as powerful as his sword. When the Greek soldiers grew weary and wanted to give up and sail home, it was often Odysseus who stood up and spoke, reminding them of their honor, their oaths, and the shame of returning home without Helen. He used his clever speeches to lift their spirits and remind them of their purpose, preventing mutiny more than once. One of the most important moments where Odysseus' wisdom was vital happened in the 9th year of the war. It was a quarrel that threatened to tear the entire Greek army apart, even more so than the powerful walls of Troy. The two greatest heroes of the Greeks, Agamemnon, the commander-in-chief, and Achilles, the mightiest warrior, fell into a bitter feud. It started when Agamemnon was forced by the god Apollo to give back a captive priestess named Circe. Apollo had sent a terrible plague upon the Greek camp because Agamemnon had taken the priestess and refused to return her. To make up for this loss, Agamemnon angrily took Perseus, another captive woman, who belonged to Achilles. Achilles was furious. He felt deeply dishonored and betrayed. He swore he would no longer fight for Agamemnon or the Greek cause. He pulled his men out of battle and watched from the sidelines as the Trojans began to push the Greeks back, causing terrible losses. Panic spread through the Greek camp. Without Achilles, their greatest fighter, their chances of winning seemed hopeless. Agamemnon, realizing his mistake, sent a group of his most trusted men to try and convince Achilles to return. Odysseus was one of them, chosen for his powerful words and his ability to reason with even the proudest heroes. Odysseus, along with Ajax and the old Phoenix, went to Achilles' tent. They offered Achilles many gifts: gold, horses, women, even the return of Perseus, and the promise of more spoils from Troy. Odysseus spoke eloquently, reminding Achilles of the suffering of his fellow Greeks, the desperate need for his strength, and the glory he would gain if he returned. He appealed to Achilles' sense of duty, his honor, and even his friendship. But Achilles, still burning with anger and pride, refused. He was stubborn and deeply hurt. He said he would not fight until the Trojans threatened his own ships. It was a crushing defeat for the Greek leaders, and Odysseus had to return with the disappointing news. Even his clever words couldn't sway Achilles' rage. This showed that even the most cunning mind couldn't always overcome raw emotion and pride. The war would continue, and the Greeks would suffer greatly, all because of a quarrel between their two greatest leaders. Odysseus could only watch and continue to lead as best he could, try and keep the army from falling apart completely in the face of Achilles' absence and the rising tide of Trojan strength. The war dragged on year after painful year. The Greeks suffered, and the Trojans, under their strong leader Hector, fought bravely. Even with Achilles out of the fight, Odysseus never stopped thinking, never stopped trying to find a way to win. His mind was always working, always looking for the angle, the weakness in Troy's defenses that no one else could see. One such moment of cunning came when the Greeks desperately needed help from an old, forgotten hero named Philoctetes. Years earlier, on their way to Troy, Philoctetes had been bitten by a poisonous snake. His wound was horrible, smelling terrible, and caused him such pain that his cries disturbed the whole Greek camp. So the Greek leaders, led by Odysseus, decided to leave him behind on a deserted island called Lemnos. They abandoned him there, alone with his pain, and only the bow and arrows of the mighty Heracles. Now, years later, the Greeks learned from a captured Trojan prophet that Troy could not be taken without the bow and arrows of Heracles. This meant they had to go back for Philoctetes, the man they had left to die. But Philoctetes hated Odysseus and the others for abandoning him. He was filled with bitterness and rage. So Odysseus and Diomedes, another cunning Greek warrior, were sent to Lemnos. They knew direct force wouldn't work. Philoctetes was too angry, and he had deadly weapons. Odysseus came up with a plan. He told Diomedes to act honestly and try to win Philoctetes' trust, while he, Odysseus, would hide and observe. When Diomedes could convince him, Odysseus stepped in. He spun a tale of woe, pretending that the Greeks were also suffering and that they now deeply regretted leaving Philoctetes. He used his silver tongue to appeal to Philoctetes' past glory, telling him that only he could save them. He even tried to steal the bow. It was a risky game of deceit and persuasion. In some versions of the story, a god, either Heracles himself or Asclepius, the god of healing, appears and tells Philoctetes that he must go to Troy, promising him healing and glory. Convinced, Philoctetes, still limping and in pain, finally agreed to come to Troy, bringing with him the magical bow and arrows that would prove vital to their victory. Odysseus' cleverness was once again crucial in getting something absolutely necessary for their success, even if it meant playing a morally gray game. The bow of Heracles would soon claim the life of Paris, the very man who had stolen Helen, and bring the war closer to its end. But the bow and arrows were not the only things needed to take Troy. The Greeks also learned that they could not conquer the city as long as the Palladium remained inside its walls. The Palladium was a sacred statue of the goddess Athena, believed to be a protector of Troy. It was said that as long as the Palladium was in the city, Troy would never fall. This meant that the Greeks needed to get inside the heavily guarded city and steal this precious statue. This was a mission for only the cleverest and most daring heroes. Odysseus and Diomedes, a pair used to working together on dangerous missions, were chosen. They disguised themselves, sneaking into Troy by night. The city was always on high alert, its walls patrolled, its gates watched. This was not a frontal attack. This was a true test of stealth and wit. They moved like shadows through the sleeping city, avoiding guards, listening to the sounds of the night. Their goal was the Temple of Athena, where the Palladium was kept, guarded by priests and soldiers. It required them to be completely silent, to pick locks, and to use every ounce of their cunning. Somehow, they managed to get into the temple, take the statue, and slip back out the city gates, unseen and unheard. When they returned to the Greek camp with the Palladium, it was a huge moment of triumph. It showed that Troy was not completely untouchable, and that their protective magic could be overcome. This act of theft, while not a battle, was a major blow to Trojan morale and a huge boost for the Greeks. It was another example of Odysseus' ability to find and exploit the enemy's weaknesses, not with brute force, but with a sharp mind and daring plans. The war was slowly turning, not through endless fighting, but through clever acts of courage and deceit. The long war continued, with battles, raids, and quiet waiting. The Greeks had managed to get the bow of Heracles and steal the Palladium, but Troy still stood strong. The greatest fighter on the Greek side, Achilles, had returned to battle after his friend Patroclus was killed by Hector. Achilles fought with terrible rage, killing many Trojans, including their noble leader Hector. This was a huge blow to Troy, but even with Hector gone, the city's walls remained unbroken. Achilles, though almost unbeatable, was not immortal. He was eventually killed by an arrow to his heel, the only weak spot on his body, shot by Paris, guided by the god Apollo. His death was a massive shock to the Greek army. Their greatest hero, their almost godlike warrior, was gone. After Achilles' death, there was a great argument over who should get his famous armor, crafted by the god Hephaestus himself. The two main heroes who wanted it were the mighty Ajax, the strongest Greek warrior after Achilles, and Odysseus, known for his wisdom and cunning. Both made strong claims. Ajax argued that his great strength and bravery in battle made him the clear choice. He had fought side by side with Achilles many times. Odysseus, however, argued that the armor should go to the hero who had contributed the most with his mind, not just his muscles. He spoke of his clever plans, his dangerous missions, and how his intelligence had saved the Greeks many times. The Greek leaders voted. In the end, they chose Odysseus. This decision deeply angered and shamed Ajax. He felt that his honor had been unfairly taken from him. In his grief and fury, possibly driven mad by the goddess Athena, he attacked a flock of sheep, believing them to be the Greek leaders. When he came to his senses and realized what he had done, he was overcome with shame and despair. He took his own sword and fell upon it, ending his life. The loss of Ajax was another heavy blow to the Greeks, removing another one of their strongest fighters. These events, the death of Achilles and the suicide of Ajax, showed that brute strength alone was not enough to win the war, and that even the greatest warriors were mortal. The Greeks were weary. 10 years they had fought, suffered, and lost many men. Troy's walls still stood, seemingly impossible to breach. It was at this moment of despair that Odysseus, the man of many tricks, came up with his most famous, most daring, and ultimately most successful plan, the Trojan Horse. He gathered the remaining Greek leaders and laid out his idea. It was simple, yet brilliant in its deception. They would build a gigantic wooden horse, hollow inside. The best of their warriors, including Odysseus himself, would hide inside. The rest of the Greek army would then burn their camp, pretend to give up, and sail away, hiding their ships behind a nearby island, Tenedos. They would leave the horse behind as a gift to Athena, claiming it was an offering to make up for stealing palladium and a way to ensure a safe journey home. To make the trick believable, they needed someone to convince the Trojans. They chose a cunning Greek named Sinon. Sinon would be left behind, pretending to be a deserter who had escaped the Greeks. He would tell a false story about the horse, saying it was too large to be brought into Troy, and that if the Trojans brought it inside, it would make their city unbeatable. If they destroyed it, they would bring down the wrath of Athena. The plan was risky in the extreme. If the Trojans saw through the trick, the warriors inside the horse would be trapped and killed. But after 10 years of endless war, the Greeks were desperate. They agreed to Odysseus' plan. Under the skilled hands of Hippias, a master carpenter, the massive wooden horse began to take shape. It was huge, big enough to hold many armed men. Inside its hollow belly, Odysseus and a select group of the bravest and most skilled Greek warriors, including Menelaus, Diomedes, and others, quietly climbed in. The trapdoor closed, plunging them into darkness. It was cramped, hot, and terrifyingly silent. They could hear the sounds of the Greek camp being burned outside, the shouts of men, the crackling of flames, all part of the great deception. Then silence. The rest of the Greek army pretended to sail away, their ships waiting hidden behind Tenedos. The next morning, the Trojans awoke to an unbelievable sight. The Greek camp was gone, replaced by smoke and ashes, and there on the beach stood a colossal wooden horse. Their joy and relief were immense. They believed the war was over, that the Greeks had finally given up and sailed home. But not everyone was fooled. Laocoon, a priest of Poseidon, warned them. He cried out, "Beware of Greeks bearing gifts." He even threw a spear at the horse, and it clanged against the hollow wood, sounding suspicious. He urged them to burn it or break it open. But just as he spoke, 2 monstrous serpents rose from the sea and attacked Laocoon and his 2 sons, dragging them under the waves. The Trojans saw this as a sign from the gods that Laocoon had insulted Athena by doubting her gift. Then Sinon appeared, pretending to be a helpless Greek deserter. The Trojans dragged him in, and he spun his elaborate tale. He claimed the Greeks had left the horse as an offering to Athena to make up for stealing palladium, and that its huge size was meant to prevent the Trojans from bringing it into their city, because if they did, Troy would become unbeatable. He even swore that he had escaped because the Greeks were planning to sacrifice him to get favorable winds, just as they had Iphigenia. His story, combined with the strange death of Laocoon, convinced the Trojans, against the warnings of the prophetess Cassandra, who was always right, but cursed so no one believed her. The Trojans, filled with triumphant joy, broke down part of their city wall and dragged the enormous wooden horse inside. They celebrated late into the night, believing their long nightmare was over. They drank, feasted, and sang, completely unaware that their doom stood silent within their very walls. As the city slept, drunk with celebration and false victory, Odysseus and the other Greek warriors emerged from the horse's belly. Silently, they opened the city gates. The hidden Greek fleet, having waited behind Tenedos, sailed back, and the rest of the army poured into the city. The fall of Troy was swift and brutal. The Greeks, fueled by 10 years of war, attacked the sleeping city with merciless fury. They slaughtered the Trojans, burning houses, and destroying everything in their path. The city, once thought unbreakable, was now ablaze, its people screaming in terror. Odysseus himself fought fiercely, leading his men to the burning streets, ensuring the city's complete destruction. The sack of Troy was a terrible event, a victory for Greeks, but one that came at a heavy cost. The Greeks had won, but they had also committed many terrible acts. They desecrated temples, showing no respect for the gods, and behaved with great arrogance, believing they had won purely by their own strength. Ajax the Lesser, a Greek hero, even dragged the Trojan priestess Cassandra from a temple, further angering the gods. Poseidon, the god of the sea, was especially angry, not just because the city, Troy, was destroyed, but because of the disrespect shown by the Greeks. Athena, too, was enraged by the actions against her temples and priestesses, even though she had helped the Greeks. These acts of hubris, this overconfidence and disrespect towards the divine, would have terrible consequences. The long journey home for many Greek heroes would be filled with suffering, and for some, like Odysseus, it would be an endless nightmare. Their victory came at a price they had yet to pay, a price that would be exacted by the very gods they had offended. The war was over, but Odysseus' greatest struggle, his 10-year Odyssey home, was just beginning. He had won the war, but he had lost his way. After the burning of Troy, the victorious Greek heroes finally turned their ships towards home, eager to return to their families after 10 long years of war. But the gods, still angry from the disrespect shown at Troy, had not forgotten. Their wrath would fall heavily on many, and perhaps most heavily on Odysseus. Odysseus and his 12 ships, filled with his loyal men and what treasures they had gathered, set sail from the smoking ruins of Troy. Their hearts were full of hope. They imagined the joyful reunions, the warmth of their homes, the sight of Ithaca's rocky shores. But their journey was immediately met with a harsh lesson. Their first stop was not a planned one. A strong wind blew them off course, pushing them north toward the land of the Cicones, a people who lived on the coast of Thrace, near a city called Ismarus. Seeing an easy target, and driven by the desire for more loot and supplies after the long war, Odysseus' men decided to raid the city. They stormed Ismarus, attacking the Cicones, killing many of the men and taking the women and children as slaves. They also plundered the city, taking wine, food, and other valuable goods. Odysseus, ever the cautious leader, knew they should leave quickly. He urged his men to get back on their ships and sail away as soon as they had their fill. He sensed danger, a feeling born from years of war and understanding the ways of people. But his men, celebrating their easy victory and filled with the thrill of battle, were too drunk and too greedy to listen. They spent the night on the beach, feasting on the captured sheep and cattle, drinking wine and boasting. They ignored Odysseus' warnings. This was their first big mistake, a moment of weakness that would cost them dearly. As dawn broke, a large, well-trained army of Cicones, reinforced by their neighbors, attacked from inland. They came on horseback, their numbers far greater than Odysseus' tired and celebrating crew. The Greeks, caught off guard and still recovering from their feasting, fought bravely, but they were no match for the fresh, organized Cicones army. The battle on the beach was fierce and bloody. Odysseus and his men were forced to retreat to their ships, fighting every step of the way. They lost many of their comrades, brave men who had survived 10 years of war only to fall on this first leg of the journey home. 6 men from each of Odysseus' 12 ships were killed, a total of 72 men lost in one quick, brutal raid. With heavy hearts and fewer numbers, Odysseus and his remaining men finally managed to launch their ships and escape the fury of the Cicones. As they pulled away from the shore, Odysseus cried out the names of his fallen men 3 times, an ancient Greek custom to honor the dead. It was a mournful farewell, a stark reminder that the journey home would not be easy, and that every mistake could lead to disaster. This quick, violent encounter taught Odysseus a painful lesson. Victory in war did not guarantee a safe return, and arrogance or lack of discipline could lead to terrible losses. The gods, it seemed, were already beginning to exact their price. The ships sailed onward, the grief of their fallen comrades a heavy cloud over surviving men. They faced strong winds and powerful storms, which tossed their ships like toys on the waves. For 9 days, fierce gales blew them across the sea, further and further off course, away from the familiar routes home. They were no longer sailing towards Ithaca, but into unknown waters, pushed by the unpredictable will of the winds and, perhaps, The growing angered the gods. On the 10th day, the storms finally died down, and they found themselves drifting towards a strange, peaceful-looking island. This was the land of the Lotus-Eaters. It seemed a welcome sight after the brutal battle with the Cicones and the terrible storms. As was their custom, Odysseus sent a small group of his men, 3 of them, ashore to explore and find out who lived there. These men were brave, ready to face whatever dangers the island might hold. But what they found was not a danger in the usual sense, not monsters or hostile warriors. Instead, they met the gentle, harmless inhabitants of the island, whose lives revolved around one unique plant, the lotus. The Lotus-Eaters offered the visitors their sacred plant, the lotus fruit. It looked harmless, perhaps even inviting, but it had a strange and powerful effect. When Odysseus's men ate the sweet, honey-like fruit, a profound change came over them. They immediately forgot everything, their mission, their desire to go home, their wives and children, even who they were. All they wanted to do was stay on the island, eating more of the lotus, living in a peaceful, dreamy state of forgetfulness. They felt no pain, no sorrow, no worry. They just wanted to stay there forever, lost in a happy haze. When the rest of the crew waited anxiously for their return, and they did not come back, Odysseus grew worried. He went ashore himself to find them. He found his men, not fighting or in trouble, but sitting calmly among the Lotus-Eaters, with faraway looks in their eyes, reaching for more of the fruit. They didn't even recognize him at first. When he tried to talk to them, to remind them of home, they looked confused, as if they had never heard of such a place. Odysseus knew at once the danger of this plant. It wasn't a monster that would kill them, but a gentle trap that would steal their very souls, their desire for their own lives. He understood that if any more of his men ate the lotus, they would be lost to him forever. Without hesitation, he had to act with force. He grabbed his 3 men, who cried out, wanting only to stay and eat more of the lotus. He dragged them, struggling and weeping softly, back to the ships. They were tied to the rowing benches, still yearning for the magical fruit. With his men securely tied, and no one else having tasted the lotus, Odysseus quickly ordered his crew to put their backs into the oars and sail away from that dangerous, alluring island as fast as they could. He didn't want anyone else to fall victim to its enchanting forgetfulness. The encounter with the Lotus-Eaters was a test of Odysseus' strong will and leadership. It showed that sometimes the greatest dangers are not those that attack with teeth and claws, but those that promise a false peace, stealing away memory and the very desire for home. Odysseus had saved his men. But the strange, empty happiness of the Lotus Island was a haunting reminder of what they could lose if they ever gave up their dream of returning. They had escaped a gentle death, and now they were sailing into a truly monstrous one. The ships kept sailing, further into the unknown, carried by winds that seemed to have a mind of their own. They reached a land that was unlike any they had seen before. It was an island filled with lush green fields, plenty of water, and caves where goats roamed freely. But there were no towns or cities, no signs of people living together. This was the land of the Cyclops, giant, one-eyed creatures who lived alone in caves, without laws or manners. They were shepherds, but wild and uncivilized, not like humans at all. Odysseus, ever curious and cautious, decided to take 1 ship and a dozen of his best men to explore. He left the rest of his ships and crew hidden safely behind another island. He brought with him a large goatskin filled with dark, sweet wine, a gift from a priest of Apollo, a wine so strong that it took 20 parts water to 1 part wine to dilute it. He also carried a bag of food. He had a strange feeling, a sense that they were about to meet someone wild and dangerous, but also a hope that he might receive a valuable gift, as was the custom of hospitality in ancient times. They arrived at a cave, a huge cavern that seemed to stretch deep into the rock. Inside, they found evidence of a giant. Huge piles of cheese, pens filled with lambs and kids, and buckets brimming with milk. It was clear that a Cyclops lived here, but he was out with his flocks. Odysseus's men begged him to take the cheese and milk, and then leave quickly. Their instincts told them to run. But Odysseus, driven by his curiosity and the hope of a host's gift, insisted on waiting for the owner of the cave to return. This decision, made with pride and a desire for adventure, would almost cost them their lives. Soon, the giant owner returned. He was a terrifying sight, a massive, ugly creature with one huge, glaring eye in the middle of his forehead. This was Polyphemus, a Cyclops and unknown to Odysseus. He was also the son of Poseidon, the god of the sea himself. Polyphemus carried a huge pile of firewood and drove his flocks into the cave. Then, with a crash that shook the earth, he rolled a giant stone in front of the cave entrance, a stone so massive that 20 strong men couldn't have moved it. They were trapped. Polyphemus milked his ewes and goats, then lit a fire, and suddenly his one eye fell upon Odysseus and his men. His voice was like thunder. He demanded to know who they were, pirates or travelers. Odysseus, trying to sound brave, explained that they were Greeks, warriors returning from Troy, lost at sea, and that they expected hospitality, as was the custom, in the name of the gods. Polyphemus roared with laughter. He didn't care about the gods or their customs. "You are fools," he scoffed. "Cyclops care nothing for Zeus or the blessed gods. We are stronger than they." And with that, he reached out, grabbed 2 of Odysseus's men, smashed their heads against the cave floor like puppies, and devoured them, bones and all. He then drank down their blood and milk. Odysseus and his remaining men watched in horror, frozen with fear, tears streaming down their faces as they witnessed this monstrous act. Odysseus knew he couldn't attack Polyphemus then. The Cyclops was too strong, and even if they killed him, they would still be trapped by the giant stone blocking the cave entrance. They spent a terrifying night inside the cave, listening to the Cyclops snore, fearing the next dawn. The next morning, Polyphemus devoured 2 more men for his breakfast, then rolled back the stone, took out his flocks, and then rolled the stone back into place, trapping them once again. Odysseus began to think. He had to find a way out, and it would require all his cunning. He noticed a massive green olive tree club lying in the cave, a tree trunk that Polyphemus used as a walking stick. It was as big as a ship's mast. Odysseus quickly cut a piece of it, about 6 feet long, and sharpened one end to a deadly point. He then hardened the tip in the fire. He hid it, planning to use it against the giant. When Polyphemus returned that evening and devoured 2 more men, Odysseus put his plan into action. He offered the Cyclops the strong, sweet wine he had brought. Polyphemus, who had never tasted wine before, drank it down greedily. He loved it, asking for more. As he drank, he became drunk and drowsy. "What is your name, stranger?" Polyphemus asked, his voice thick with wine. "Tell me, so I can give you a guest gift." Odysseus, with a clever smile, replied, "My name is Nobody." Polyphemus, chuckling in his drunken state, promised, "Well, Nobody, I will eat you last of all your friends. That will be my guest gift to you." And with that, he collapsed in a drunken sleep. Now was their chance. Odysseus and his men quickly took the sharpened, fire-hardened club. They plunged its sharp end into the dying embers of the fire, making it glow red-hot. Then, with all their strength, they rammed the burning stake directly into Polyphemus's single giant eye. The Cyclops let out a horrifying shriek, a scream so loud it echoed to the cave and across the island. He ripped the stake from his eye, now blind and in terrible pain. He thrashed around the cave, roaring in agony, blindly searching for the men who had done this to him. Odysseus and his men quickly scattered, hiding among the sheep. Other Cyclops from neighboring caves heard Polyphemus's cries and came to the entrance. "What troubles you, Polyphemus?" they shouted. "Why do you scream so loud in the night? Is someone stealing your sheep? Is someone trying to kill you by treachery?" Polyphemus, in his blinding pain, roared back, Nobody is killing me by treachery." Hearing nobody and not seeing anyone else, the other Cyclops simply assumed Polyphemus was sick or had gone mad, perhaps by divine curse. "If no one is hurting you," they replied, "then it must be a sickness from Zeus, and we can do nothing." And so they left him to his misery. This was a brilliant trick, but they still needed to escape the cave. As dawn approached, Polyphemus, still in agony, rolled back the giant stone to let his sheep out to graze. But he stood at the entrance, running his hands over the backs of each sheep as it passed, making sure no man was clinging to their wool. Odysseus, thinking quickly, came up with one last desperate plan. He took thick branches and tightly tied his men, one under each of the largest rams. He himself clung to the belly of the biggest ram of all. As the sheep slowly shuffled out of the cave, Polyphemus felt only the backs of his animals, completely unaware that his enemies were escaping right under his hands. Once outside and a safe distance from the cave, Odysseus and his men untied themselves and quickly rushed the stolen sheep to their ship. They scrambled aboard, pulling hard on the oars, sailing away as fast as they could. But as they got further from the shore, Odysseus, unable to resist one final boast, shouted back at the blind giant, "Polyphemus, if anyone asks you who blinded you, tell them it was Odysseus, son of Laertes, the king of Ithaca." This act of hubris, this proud revelation of his true name, was another grave mistake. Polyphemus, hearing the name of his tormentor, erupted in a furious prayer to his father, Poseidon, the god of the sea. "Hear me, great Poseidon," he cried. "Grant that Odysseus, son of Laertes, king of Ithaca, may never reach his home. But if he is destined to return, let him come late in misery, after losing all his companions, and find trouble in his own house." Poseidon heard his son's prayer, and this curse would indeed haunt Odysseus for the next 10 years, turning his journey home into a brutal, never-ending trial. The encounter with Polyphemus was a testament to Odysseus' cunning, his ability to outsmart overwhelming power, but also cemented the eternal hatred of a powerful god, making his long-desired return to Ithaca almost impossible. They had escaped, but at a terrible price. They were now sailing directly into the wrath of the sea itself. The ships sailed away from the land of the Cyclops, their oars churning through the water, leaving behind the roars of the blinded giant. The men were relieved to be alive, but also terrified by what they had just seen and by the powerful curse Polyphemus had called down upon their captain. They understood that the sea itself was now their enemy, guided by the fury of Poseidon. For a while, they sailed through difficult waters, winds pushing them, waves crashing against their ships. But then they reached a strange and beautiful island. This was Aeolia, the floating island home of Aeolus, the king of the winds. Aeolus was a friend of the gods, a kind and generous ruler who lived a peaceful life with his 12 children, 6 sons and 6 daughters, who were married to each other. His island was surrounded by unbreakable bronze walls. Aeolus welcomed Odysseus and his men with great warmth. He offered them hospitality, feasting them for a whole month. During this time, Odysseus told Aeolus all about the Trojan War and his terrible journey so far. Aeolus, moved by Odysseus' story and charmed by his wise words, decided to help him. When it was time for Odysseus and his men to leave, Aeolus gave Odysseus a special gift, a bag made of oxhide, tied shut with silver cord. Inside this bag, Aeolus had captured all the stormy, harmful winds, binding them so they couldn't escape. He left only the gentle west wind free to blow, to guide Odysseus' ships safely towards Ithaca. Aeolus warned Odysseus that this bag was a sacred gift and should not be opened by anyone else. He was to keep it safe and use only the west wind to get home. Odysseus was overjoyed. With the west wind gently pushing their ships and all the dangerous gales trapped, he knew they would finally reach Ithaca. He did not sleep for 9 days and nights, tirelessly holding the tiller of his ship, keeping watch, always with his hand on the bag of winds, eager to see his home. They sailed swiftly, and soon Ithaca was in sight. They could see the smoke rising from their own chimneys, the familiar outlines of the mountains, and even the people moving on the shore. After years of war and endless wandering, home was finally within reach. Odysseus was filled with a joy he hadn't felt in a decade. Exhausted, he finally let sleep take him, believing his long ordeal was over. But his men, watching him sleep, grew suspicious. They had seen the heavy bag Aeolus had given Odysseus, and they thought it was filled with gold and silver, treasures that Odysseus was keeping all for himself. They had suffered so much, fought so hard, and now they believed their captain was hoarding all the riches. Their greed and envy overcame their loyalty and good sense. While Odysseus slept, some of the men whispered among themselves, "Look at him." One might have said, "He's bringing back piles of gold from Troy, and we get nothing but hardship." Another might have added, "That bag! It must be full of treasures from the kind Aeolus, and he won't share it." They plotted to open it. They crept silently towards the sleeping Odysseus, unfastened the silver cord, and ripped open the bag. In an instant, all the wild, stormy winds that Aeolus had captured burst out with a terrible roar. A mighty gale erupted, a hurricane that slammed into their ships with unimaginable force. The ships were instantly caught in the violent storm, torn from their course, and flung backward across the sea. The gentle west wind was no match for the fury of all the unleashed winds. They were swept away from the sight of Ithaca, away from home, faster than they had ever sailed before. Odysseus woke with a shock, seeing the terrible storm and understanding immediately what his men had done. He was filled with despair. He thought about throwing himself overboard and drowning, but his strong will, his stubborn desire to reach home, kept him alive. He groaned, covering his face, watching as the dream of Ithaca faded into the raging storm. Against their will, the ships were driven back to the floating island of Aeolia, the very place they had just left. Odysseus, heartbroken and ashamed, went to Aeolus's palace once more, begging for help, explaining what his foolish men had done. But Aeolus, seeing Odysseus return, became angry. "Get out," he shouted. "You are the most cursed of men. It is clear now that the gods hate you and do not want you to reach your home. I cannot help someone whom the blessed gods hate so much." With those harsh words, Aeolus sent Odysseus and his men away. They were now truly alone, without any help from the gods or from men, sailing on a sea that seemed actively hostile to them. They had been so close, almost touching the shores of Ithaca, only to be thrown back in the endless, dangerous ocean by their own folly and greed. The bitter irony of being sent back from the very doorstep of home must have been a crushing blow. Their journey was turning into a waking nightmare, a desperate struggle against fate itself. They sailed on from Aeolia, discouraged and exhausted, without any guiding winds. They rowed tirelessly for 6 days and nights, until on the 7th day, they reached another strange land. This was the island of the Laestrygonians, a place of terrible giants. The harbor was perfect, a narrow opening between 2 towering cliffs, with good anchorage inside. All of Odysseus's ships, except his own, sailed into this sheltered bay. His own ship, driven by his usual caution, stayed outside the harbor, tied to a rock. He had a bad feeling, a sense of unease about the perfectly calm, hidden harbor. Odysseus sent 3 of his men ashore to explore the land and find out what kind of people lived there. They soon came across a young woman, a giantess, the daughter of Antiphates, the king of the Laestrygonians. She was a frightening sight, tall as a tree. She led them to her father's palace. There, they met King Antiphates and his queen, who were even more monstrous. As soon as they saw Odysseus's men, the queen let out a horrible scream. Antiphates, without a word of welcome, immediately grabbed one of Odysseus's men and devoured him like a meal. The other 2 men fled in terror, running back towards their ships. Antiphates then let out a piercing war cry, alerting all the other giants of the island. Suddenly, massive Laestrygonians appeared from all directions, hundreds of them, as tall as oak trees, with enormous hands and monstrous faces. They swarmed to the cliffs overlooking the harbor, where Odysseus's ships were anchored. From the high cliffs, the giants began to hurl massive rocks down onto the ships trapped in the harbor below. These were not just rocks. They were boulders the size of houses. The crashing stones smashed the ships to splinters, ripping them apart and sending men screaming into the water. The Laestrygonians then leaped down into the harbor, spearing the drowning sailors like fish with their giant harpoons, carrying them off to feast on. It was a terrible, swift slaughter. Odysseus, from his position outside the harbor, watched in horror as his entire fleet, except his own ship, was destroyed. He saw his loyal men who had survived Troy and countless dangers being eaten by the monstrous giants. There was nothing he could do to save them. With a heavy heart, knowing that every man on the other 11 ships was lost, Odysseus quickly cut the mooring rope of his own ship. He shouted to his remaining crew, urging them to row for their lives, to escape this nightmare. They rowed with all their might, pulling desperately away from the gruesome harbor, leaving behind the screams of their dying comrades and the terrible sounds of giants feasting. Only Odysseus' single ship and a handful of men on board managed to escape the land of the Laestrygonians. In one horrifying attack, he had lost 11 of his 12 ships and almost all of his remaining crew. The once mighty fleet that had sailed from Troy was now reduced to a single vessel, carrying a small, terrified band of survivors. This was a devastating blow, a moment of profound loss that stripped Odysseus of nearly everything he had left. The journey home had become a desperate struggle for mere survival, sailing into an unknown future with very little hope. After escaping the land of the monstrous Laestrygonians, Odysseus and his few remaining men, on their single ship, sailed on, heartbroken and exhausted. The sea was their enemy, and every new island felt like a trap. For a long time, they sailed without knowing where they were going, just trying to survive. Finally, they reached another island. It was a large, thickly wooded place called Aeolus. Smoke rose from the center of the island, a sign that someone lived there. But after the horrors of the Cicones, the Lotus-Eaters, and the Laestrygonians, Odysseus was extra careful. He did not rush ashore. Instead, he led his men to a safe, quiet cove, and they rested for 2 days and nights, too tired and sad to do much else. On the third day, Odysseus, desperate for food and information, decided to explore. He climbed to a high point on the island. From there, he could see the entire island, and in the very middle through the thick trees, he saw a house of stone. Smoke was clearly rising from it. He knew someone lived there. He also spotted a magnificent stag, a large deer, heading towards a ship for water. Odysseus, a skilled hunter, killed the stag with a spear, tied its huge body to his back, and carried it all the way back to his ship. His men were overjoyed to see him and have fresh meat after so much hardship. They feasted, and for a short time their spirits lifted. The next morning, Odysseus decided it was time to learn more about the inhabitants of the island. He divided his small group of men into 2 parties. He led one group himself, and the other, 22 men, was led by Eurylochus, a brave and loyal man who was also a relative of Odysseus. They drew lots to see which group would go and explore the house in the center of the island. The lot fell to Eurylochus' group. Eurylochus and his men set off, following the path through the dense forest until they reached the stone house. It was a strange sight. Around the house, they saw lions and wolves, but instead of attacking them, these wild beasts acted strangely tame. They fawned over men, wagging their tails like dogs, as if they had been tamed by a human hand. These were not natural animals. They were men who had been changed by magic. As the men approached the house, they heard a beautiful voice singing from inside. It was a woman weaving at her loom. The men, except for Eurylochus, were drawn to sound, mesmerized by the enchanting melody. They called out, and a beautiful woman appeared, inviting them in. This was the goddess Circe, a powerful sorceress. The men, eager for hospitality and rest, walked inside. Circe welcomed them with a warm smile, offering them a meal of cheese, barley, and honey, mixed with special, dark wine. But into this mixture, she secretly added a powerful drug that would make them forget their homes and turn them into beasts. As soon as they ate and drank, she struck them with her magic wand, and in an instant, all the men, except for Eurylochus, were transformed into pigs. Their bodies changed, their voices became grunts, and they were driven into pigsties, crying and rooting around in the mud. They still had their human minds, but they were trapped in animal bodies. Eurylochus, cautious and suspicious, had stood outside the house, sensing something was wrong. When his comrades didn't return and he heard the strange sounds, he became terrified. He ran back to the forest of the ship, tears streaming down his face, barely able to speak. He told Odysseus the terrifying story. The beautiful woman, the strange animals, the disappearances of his men, and the sounds of pigs from inside the house. He was sure it was a trap, and he begged Odysseus to flee, to leave the island at once and save their last ship. But Odysseus, loyal to his men and determined not to abandon them, refused to leave. His heart was heavy with anger and a fierce desire to rescue his trapped crew. He strapped on his sword and shield, grabbed his bow, and prepared to go to Circe's house alone. Eurylochus tried to stop him, clinging to his knees, weeping and pleading, reminding him of all the men they had already lost. But Odysseus was firm. He had to try. As Odysseus made his way through the forest toward Circe's house, he was met by a young, handsome man. This was the god Hermes, sent by Zeus to help Odysseus. Hermes appeared in the form of a youth, carrying a golden wand. He knew Circe's magic and warned Odysseus about the drug she would put in his food and drink. "But do not fear, wily Odysseus," Hermes said. "I will give you a special herb called moly." He pulled a small black-rooted plant with a white flower from the ground and handed it to Odysseus. "This plant will protect you from Circe's spells. When she strikes you with her wand, rush at her with your sword, as if to kill her. She will be frightened and will offer to swear an oath. Make her swear by the great gods that she will not harm you, and that she will turn your men back into humans." Hermes also gave him crucial advice. Once Circe swore the oath, Odysseus must share her bed. This was part of the ritual to truly break her spell and gain her trust. After giving this vital help, Hermes vanished as quickly as he had appeared. Armed with the magical moly and Hermes' instructions, Odysseus continued to Circe's house. He entered, and Circe welcomed him, just as she had his men. She offered him the same potion, mixed with the same magical drug. Odysseus drank it down, confident in the power of the moly. When she struck him with her wand and told him to go join his pigs, he did not change. Instead, he drew his sharp sword and rushed at her, as Hermes had instructed, as if to take her life. Circe shrieked in surprise and fear. She fell to her knees, begging for mercy. She knew then that he was Odysseus, the only mortal who could resist her magic, and that a god must have helped him. She offered to swear the oath. Odysseus, remembering Hermes' words, made her swear by the great gods that she would not try to harm him or play any more tricks. Once the oath was sworn, he agreed to put away his sword. Circe then led him to her bed, and they lay together, confirming her pledge. After this, Odysseus finally spoke to his men. "Goddess," he said, "how can I eat or drink when my men are trapped in pigsties?" Circe, now truly understanding her defeat, went to the pigsties. She rubbed a different potion on each of the pigs, and one by one, they changed back into men. They were younger, stronger, and more handsome than before. When they saw Odysseus, they rushed to him, weeping with joy, clinging to him. Odysseus, too, wept with relief and happiness at having saved his crew. Circe, now a benevolent host, urged Odysseus to return to his ship and bring his other men to her house. Odysseus obeyed, going back to his ship. His remaining crew, led by Eurylochus, were still terrified and refused to go at first. Eurylochus even tried to argue with Odysseus, saying it was foolish to trust Circe again. But Odysseus, filled with anger at Eurylochus' disobedience and his insulting words, almost killed him then and there. His other men stepped in, stopping him. Finally, Odysseus brought the rest of his crew to Circe's house. There they were bathed, clothed, and treated with kindness. For a whole year, they lived in luxury on Circe's island, feasting, drinking, and resting. It was a paradise after so many years of hardship. Odysseus forgot about home, lost in the comfort and pleasure. But after a year had passed, his men, remembering their families and their journey, finally came to him. They gently reminded him, "Odysseus, what are you doing here? It is time to think of Ithaca and of your home." Odysseus was jolted back to reality. He went to Circe and told her he must leave. Circe, though sad to see him go, did not try to hold him against his will. She gave him advice for his journey, but she also told him something startling. Before he could return home, he had to undertake one more terrifying journey. He had to go to the land of the dead, the Underworld, to seek advice from a blind prophet, Tiresias. Only Tiresias could tell him the way home and what dangers still lay ahead. This was a shocking command. To go to the land of the dead meant facing ghosts, horrors, and the deepest fears of any living man. But Odysseus, knowing it was the only way to get back to Ithaca, agreed, with a heavy heart. He and his men prepared for the most frightening journey of all, a descent into the darkness of the realm beneath the earth, the journey to the land of the dead. To reach the underworld, the realm of the dead, was no easy task for living men. Circe gave Odysseus clear instructions. They had to sail to the very edge of the world, to the land of Cimmerians, a shadowy place always covered in mist and darkness, where the sun never shone. Once there, they would find the entrance to the Underworld. They sailed with great caution, guided by Circe's magic, until they reached the dark and misty shores. They landed their ship near a dark, flowing river, the Acheron, one of the rivers of the Underworld. Following Circe's directions, Odysseus made a special offering to attract the spirits of the dead. He dug a trench, and into it he poured milk, honey, wine, water, and finally, the blood of black sheep and a ram that he had sacrificed. The smell of the blood, especially, was said to draw the shades, the spirits of the deceased. As the blood soaked into the earth, countless spirits began to rise from the dark ground. They swarmed around Odysseus and his men, a mournful, wailing crowd of the dead. They were old men and women, young boys and girls, and fierce warriors, all eager to drink the fresh blood and speak with the living. It was a terrifying sight and sound, but Odysseus stood firm, his sword drawn, preventing any spirit from drinking the blood before Tiresias, the blind prophet, arrived. The first spirit to approach, and a heartbreaking one for Odysseus, was his own comrade, Elpenor. Elpenor was one of his men who had died back on Circe's island just before they left. In their haste to depart, they had forgotten to properly bury him. Elpenor's ghost begged Odysseus to return to Circe's island and give his body a proper burial, so his spirit could find peace. Odysseus promised he would. This was a sad reminder of the cost of their journey and the importance of honoring the dead. Then at last, the ancient, blind prophet Tiresias appeared, holding a golden staff. His spirit, unlike the others, was clear and strong. He was allowed to drink the blood, and once he had, his eyes, though sightless in life, seemed to gaze into the future. He spoke to Odysseus, giving him the prophecy he desperately needed. Tiresias confirmed that Poseidon was indeed furious with Odysseus for blinding his son, Polyphemus. He warned Odysseus of the many dangers still ahead on his journey home. Most importantly, he told Odysseus about the cattle of the sun god, Helios, on an island called Phaeacia. He warned Odysseus that if his men harmed those sacred cattle, they would all die, and Odysseus would be the only survivor, facing more hardship before he reached home. Tiresias also told him that once he finally returned to Ithaca, he would find his palace full of rude men, suitors trying to marry his wife and take his kingdom. He would have to fight a terrible battle to reclaim his home. Finally, Tiresias foretold that after he had restored order in Ithaca, Odysseus would have to make one last journey inland to a place where people knew nothing of the sea, carrying an oar until someone mistook it for a winnowing fan, a tool for separating grain. There, he was to make a sacrifice to Poseidon, and only then would he find a peaceful death in his old age, far from the sea. After Tiresias spoke, Odysseus met other spirits of the dead. He spoke with his own mother, Anticlea. He was surprised and heartbroken to see her there, as he hadn't known she had died. She told him that she had died from grief and longing for him and his return. She spoke of Penelope's unwavering loyalty and Telemachus's struggle with the arrogant suitors in Ithaca. This conversation filled Odysseus with both sorrow and a renewed determination to get home. He also spoke with other famous heroes. Agamemnon, the great Greek leader who was murdered by his own wife Clytemnestra and her lover upon his return from Troy. Agamemnon warned Odysseus about the dangers of returning home and advised him to be cautious and secretive. He told Odysseus to never trust his wife fully and to land secretly in Ithaca, which would prove to be very wise advice. The mighty Achilles, who still believed that it was better to be a living slave than a king among the dead. He asked about his son Neoptolemus and was proud to hear of his bravery in the Trojan War. Ajax, the proud warrior who had taken his own life after losing Achilles' armor to Odysseus. Odysseus tried to speak to him, to make amends, but Ajax remained silent and turned away, his bitterness still strong even in death. This was a painful reminder of Odysseus's past actions and their lasting consequences. Odysseus saw many other famous figures in the underworld, men and women from old myths and legends, including Minos, Orion, Tantalus, and Sisyphus. It was a chilling and humbling experience, a journey into the ultimate darkness, where he faced the ghosts of the past and the truths of his own future. With Tiresias' prophecy and the words of his mother and fallen comrades heavy in his mind, Odysseus and his men, shaken but wiser, left the realm of the dead. They sailed back to Circe's island, as she had instructed, and as Elpenor's ghost had pleaded. Upon their return to Aea, the first thing they did was find Elpenor's body. They carried it with respect, built a funeral pyre, burned his body, and buried his ashes with his armor, placing a stone in his or on top of his grave to mark it properly. This act brought peace to Elpenor's spirit and showed the men's devotion to their fallen comrade. Circe welcomed them back warmly. She helped them prepare for the next leg of their journey, providing them with food and fresh supplies. But more importantly, she gave Odysseus detailed advice and warnings about the dangers that lay ahead, especially the sirens Scylla and Charybdis. Her advice, combined with Tiresias' prophecy, would be crucial for their survival. With new knowledge and a clear, albeit terrifying, path laid out before him, Odysseus and his remaining crew prepared to face the next trials of the sea. The time came to leave Circe's island, a place of brief comfort before the renewed terrors of the sea. Odysseus gathered his men, now fewer in number but stronger in spirit after their year of rest and the chilling journey to the Underworld. Circe had warned him about the dangers ahead, giving him instructions for each. His first challenge would be the sirens. The sirens were terrible creatures with the bodies of birds and the heads of beautiful women. They lived on a rocky island, surrounded by the bones and decaying bodies of countless sailors who had been lured to their deaths. Their power lay not in strength or claws, but in their voices. They sang the most beautiful, irresistible songs in the world, melodies that promised knowledge, glory, and pleasure, luring any sailor who heard them to steer their ship onto the rocks and their doom. No man had ever heard their song and lived. Odysseus knew he had to hear their song. He was a man of immense curiosity, eager for all knowledge, even forbidden knowledge. But he also knew the danger, so he followed Circe's advice. He took a large cake of beeswax and kneaded it until it was soft. Then he cut it into small pieces and pressed them firmly into the ears of all his men, blocking out all sound. "Tie me to the mast," Odysseus commanded his crew. "Bind me tightly, so I cannot escape. If I beg you, if I plead and struggle, tie me tighter still. Do not free me, no matter what, until we are well past the Sirens' island." His men, their ears stuffed with wax, tied him tightly to the mast of the ship, knotting the rope so securely that he could not move. Then they took up their oars and began to row. As they approached the Sirens' island, the wind died down and a strange magical calm fell over the sea. The ship slowed, and then the voices began. Even through the bonds, even with the distance, Odysseus heard them. The siren song was beyond anything he could have imagined. It promised him everything he desired: knowledge of all that happened in the world, the truth of his own future, comfort from his long journey, endless pleasure. He heard their voices calling him by name, promising him rest and glory. The longing was unbearable. He strained against his bonds, his face contorted with desperation, yelling at his men to untie him, to let him go to the enchanting singers. He gestured wildly, begging them with his eyes. But his men, deafened by the wax, saw only his struggles and, remembering his orders, tied him even tighter, pulling the ropes until they bit into his flesh. They continued to row, their faces grim, until the sound of the siren's song faded behind them. Only when the voices were completely gone and Odysseus stopped struggling did his men remove the wax from their ears and untie him. He was weak with relief and the lingering longing for the song, but he was alive. He had heard the forbidden music and survived, a testament to his foresight and his men's obedience. They had escaped one danger, but a far greater one awaited them. Circe had also warned Odysseus about a narrow strait, a terrifying passage between two massive rock faces. On one side lived Scylla, a horrifying monster. On the other, the deadly whirlpool, Charybdis. Circe had explained the impossible choice. There was no way to pass through without facing one of them. Charybdis was a vast, gaping mouth in the sea, a whirlpool that swallowed the ocean itself 3 times a day, then spit out again with a terrible roar. Anything caught in her pull would be sucked down and destroyed, ship and crew alike. There was no escaping her once caught. Scylla was even more terrifying. She lived in a dark cave high up on the opposite cliff. She had 12 ugly, dangling feet, 6 long, snake-like necks, and on each neck was a head with 3 rows of sharp, dog-like teeth. When a ship passed, she would snatch 6 men from its deck, 1 for each of her heads, and devour them alive. Circe had warned Odysseus that it was better to face Scylla and lose 6 men than to try and avoid her and lose the entire ship to Charybdis. She told him that there was no way to fight Scylla. She was a force of nature, an unavoidable disaster. Odysseus kept Circe's warning a secret from his men. He knew that if they understood the terrible choice, they might panic and refuse to row, making their situation even worse. He simply told them to row with all their might towards a cliff where Scylla lived, to avoid the deadly whirlpool. He himself, ignoring Circe's advice, put on his armor and grabbed his 2 longest spears, ready to fight, believing he could somehow defend his men. He did not want to lose a single man. As they approached the narrow passage, the men, terrified by the roaring sound of Charybdis sucking in the sea on one side, looked anxiously towards that monster. But Odysseus had his eyes fixed on Scylla's cliff, waiting for the unavoidable attack. Suddenly, just as their ship was almost to the narrow passage, Scylla's monstrous heads shot out from her cave. They snatched 6 of Odysseus's bravest and strongest men from the deck of the ship. The men cried out, their hands reaching out to Odysseus in their final moments, as the monster dragged them into her cave. Odysseus watched in horror, unable to help them, remembering Circe's words that Scylla could not be fought. It was the most heartbreaking sight he had ever seen, the cries of his dying men echoing in his ears. With 6 more men gone, the ship finally cleared the dangerous passage, leaving Scylla and Charybdis behind. Odysseus and his remaining crew were numb with grief and terror. They had survived, but at a terrible cost. Each monstrous encounter stripped away more of his crew, leaving him with fewer and fewer men to guide back to Ithaca. The journey was a relentless test, not just of his strength, but of his will to endure such unbearable losses. They pressed on, leaving the horrors of Scylla and Charybdis behind. The remaining men were few, their spirits worn thin, but the hope of Ithaca still burned within them. They sailed for a while, tired and weary, until they saw an island bathed in a soft, golden light. This was Thrinacia, the island of the sun god, Helios. Both the blind prophet Tiresias and the sorceress Circe had warned Odysseus about this island. They had told him, in no uncertain terms, that under no circumstances should he or his men harm the sacred cattle and sheep of Helios that graze on the island. These animals were immortal, belonging to a god, and touching them would bring terrible destruction upon them all. They were told to sail past this island without stopping. Odysseus, remembering these stern warnings, wanted to avoid the island completely. He knew the risk was too great, but his men, led by Eurylochus, were exhausted and desperate. They had just survived the horrors of Scylla and Charybdis. They were famished, and the sight of land, with its promise of rest and food, was too tempting to resist. Eurylochus argued fiercely with Odysseus. "Captain," he pleaded, "you are strong, but we are worn out. We have faced death. We are starving. We must land and rest. We swear we will not touch the cattle. We will find food elsewhere, perhaps on the other side of the island." The rest of the crew joined in, their voices weak with hunger and fatigue. Odysseus, seeing their exhaustion and knowing their desperation, finally gave in, but with a heavy heart. He made them all swear a solemn oath that they would not touch a single one of Helios's animals. They swore by the gods, raising their hands to the sky. They landed on Thrinacia, and at first they kept their oath. They found a sheltered cove and made camp. But then a cruel twist of fate struck. A terrible storm blew in, sent by Zeus himself, perhaps at Poseidon's request, or as a general punishment for the Greeks' past misdeeds at Troy. For a whole month, the storm raged. The winds howled, the waves crashed, and they were trapped on the island, unable to sail. Their food supplies quickly ran out. They tried to fish, but the storm made it impossible to catch anything. They ate the last of their barley and wine. Hunger gnawed at their bellies. Day by day, they grew weaker, their oath weighing heavily on them, but their hunger growing stronger. One day, while Odysseus went inland to pray to the gods for help, hoping to find a way out of their desperate situation, he fell into a deep sleep. This was likely the work of the gods, who intended to punish the men for their coming crime. While he slept, Eurylochus, driven by hunger and desperation, spoke to the men. "Listen, friends," Eurylochus said, his voice weak but firm. "We are starving here. Death by hunger is the most terrible death. We would rather die trying something than waste away like this. Let us take the fattest of Helios's cattle. We will offer them as a sacrifice to the gods, and when we get back to Ithaca, we will build a magnificent temple to Helios to make up for this." The men, their minds clouded by hunger, agreed. They broke their solemn oath to Odysseus and to the gods. They drove the fattest of Helios's cattle from their pastures, sacrificed them, and began to roast the meat. The smell of the roasting beef reached Odysseus in his sleep. He woke with a start, knowing instantly what had happened. He rushed back to the ship, his heart sinking with dread. As soon as he saw the cooking meat, he cried out to the gods. He knew this was the end. Helios, the sun god, was enraged. He heard the sizzling of his beloved cattle on the spits and rushed to Olympus, complaining to Zeus and the other gods. "Father Zeus," Helios cried, "punish these men who have dared to slaughter my sacred cattle. If they are not punished, I will go down to Hades and shine my light among the dead." Zeus promised Helios that he would strike the ship with a lightning bolt once they were back at sea. When the storm finally passed, after the men had feasted for days on forbidden meat, Odysseus and his men launched their ship, their bellies full, but their spirits still heavy with dread. They had barely sailed out into the open sea when Zeus, true to his word, sent a terrifying sign. Dark clouds gathered overhead, the sky turned black, and a monstrous lightning bolt, fired from Zeus's hand, struck Odysseus's ship. The mast cracked, timbers shattered, and the ship was instantly ripped apart. The men were thrown into the raging waves, drowning in the churning waters. Odysseus himself clung to a piece of the mast and the keelson, the bottom part of the ship, tying them together to make a makeshift raft. He saw his last remaining men disappear beneath the waves, swallowed by the sea. Once again, Odysseus was utterly alone, adrift on the vast, angry ocean. Charybdis, the whirlpool he had just passed, now loomed before him, sucking down his flimsy raft. He desperately clung to a fig tree growing from the rocks above the whirlpool, waiting for his raft to be spit out again. He hung there, exhausted, until his raft reappeared. He dropped down onto it and was swept away by the currents, narrowly escaping the deadly monster once more. For 9 days and nights, Odysseus drifted, completely at the mercy of the waves and winds. He was exhausted, starving and alone. It seemed the gods truly wanted him to die. On the 10th day, weak and almost lifeless, he was washed ashore on a new island. This was Ogygia, a lush, beautiful island, filled with caves and forests, far from the paths of men. And it was the home of the nymph Calypso, a powerful and beautiful goddess, daughter of the Titan Atlas. Calypso found Odysseus, shipwrecked and half dead, on her shores. She was enchanted by him. She rescued him, brought him to her cave, gave him food and drink, and nursed him back to health. But Calypso did not intend to let him leave. She wanted him for her husband, to live with her forever on her remote island. She offered him eternal life and youth, a chance to escape all human suffering and grow old. She promised him a life of luxury and endless pleasure. For 7 long, agonizing years, Odysseus was held captive on Ogygia. He shared Calypso's bed, but his heart was never truly in it. Every day, he would go to the shore, stare out at the endless sea, and weep for his lost home, his wife Penelope and his son Telemachus. He longed for the rugged shores of Ithaca, for the simple life he had left behind. Even the promise of immortality could not erase his desire to return to his mortal life, to his family, to his true self. He was a prisoner of love and longing, caught between the desire of a goddess and the unbreakable pull of home, escaping Calypso, the will of the gods. 7 years. That's how long Odysseus stayed on Ogygia, a beautiful island that felt more like a golden prison. Calypso, the shimmering nymph with lovely braids, loved him deeply. She did everything she could to make him forget his past, to make him happy. She cooked for him, sang to him, bathed him, and offered him the greatest gift that God could give a mortal: eternal life. He could live forever with her, young and untouched by suffering. But Odysseus, even surrounded by such beauty and comfort, could not be happy. Every day, his heart ached for Ithaca. Every morning, he would sit on the rocky shore, staring out at the endless, shimmering sea, his eyes filled with tears. He longed for the familiar sight of his island, for the embrace of Penelope, for the son he barely knew as a man. His sorrow was a constant companion, a silent protest against the goddess's will. Meanwhile, high on Mount Olympus, the gods were finally taking notice. Most of them felt pity for Odysseus, especially Athena, the goddess of wisdom and war, who had always favored him. She saw his suffering and knew it was unjust. She approached her father, Zeus, the king of the gods, and pleaded for Odysseus' release. She reminded Zeus of Odysseus' courage and his piety, how he had always honored the gods, despite his many misfortunes. Zeus, who had allowed Poseidon's wrath to punish Odysseus, finally agreed that it was time for the hero to go home. He sent his messenger, the swift-footed god Hermes, to Ogygia, with a clear order for Calypso: release Odysseus. Hermes flew across the sea, landing on Calypso's island. He found a nymph in her beautiful, sweet-smelling cave, and she immediately knew the will of Zeus. She was angry and sad. She loved Odysseus and felt it was unfair that the male gods had immortal lovers. But she, a goddess, was forbidden to keep a mortal man she loved. But she knew she could not defy Zeus's command. Calypso approached Odysseus, who was once again sitting on the shore, weeping. "Odysseus," she said, her voice gentle, "you may leave now. Zeus has commanded it. I will help you build a raft, and I will give you supplies for your journey." Odysseus, at first, was suspicious. He had faced so many tricks and dangers. He made her swear a solemn oath by the Styx, a sacred river in the Underworld, by which even gods swear binding oaths, that she would not plot any further harm against him. Once she swore, his heart swelled with cautious hope. He could finally leave. Over the next 4 days, Odysseus, with Calypso's help, worked tirelessly. He cut down 20 trees, shaped them with his bronze axe, and built a sturdy raft. Calypso brought him cloth for sails, food, and wine for the journey. On the 5th day, with a fair wind sent by Calypso, Odysseus bid her farewell and pushed his raft into the sea, a solitary figure on a vast ocean, finally free, but still far from home. For 17 days, Odysseus sailed his raft, guiding it by the stars. He was tired but hopeful. He could see the land of the Phaeacians on the horizon, a new hope for safety. But Poseidon, the god of the sea, who still hated Odysseus for blinding his son Polyphemus, saw him. He was returning from a visit to the Ethiopians and spotted Odysseus sailing peacefully across his waters. Enraged, Poseidon unleashed another terrible storm. He gathered dark clouds, stirred up massive waves, and sent roaring winds to shatter Odysseus' raft. The raft was tossed about like a toy, breaking apart under the brutal assault. Odysseus was thrown into the churning, freezing water. He clung to a broken piece of timber, battling the monstrous waves for 2 days and 2 nights, a speck against the fury of the sea. Just when he thought he would surely drown, the sea goddess Leucothea, who once was a mortal queen, saw his struggle. Pitying him, she rose from the waves in the form of a sea bird. She gave him her magical veil, telling him to tie it around his chest. "This veil will protect you from harm," she said, "but you must throw it back into the sea once you reach land." She vanished, leaving Odysseus clinging to his broken timber with this new, strange hope. Odysseus, cautious as ever, hesitated at first, wondering if this was another trick. But desperate, he took off his clothes, tied the veil around his chest, and let go of the timber, trusting his fate to the goddess. He was then tossed by a giant wave onto the sharp rocks of the coastline. He barely managed to cling on, his skin torn, before being pulled back by the receding water. He finally found a river mouth, prayed to the river god, and was gently carried ashore. He was naked, battered, and exhausted, but alive. He found a thick olive grove, 2 trees growing so close that their branches provided perfect shelter from the cold night winds and rain. He burrowed into a pile of leaves, exhausted beyond words, and fell into a deep, much-needed sleep. He had lost everything again, his ship, his men, his raft, and now even his clothes. But he had survived. The Phaeacian encounter, Nausicaa, and the royal welcome. The next morning, Odysseus awoke, still weak but alive. He was on the island of Scheria, the land of the Phaeacians. These people were blessed by the gods, living in peace, skilled at sailing, and far from the troubles of other mortals. That same morning, Nausicaa, the beautiful young princess of the Phaeacians, daughter of King Alcinous and Queen Arete, was playing ball on the beach with her maidens. She had been sent there by Athena, disguised as a friend, who appeared in her dream and told her to go wash clothes at the river. Athena knew that Odysseus was coming and wanted him to find help. As the maidens played, their ball accidentally landed in the water, and their joyful shouts woke Odysseus. He crawled out from the bushes, naked and covered in leaves, a terrifying sight to the young women. His appearance scattered the maidens in fear, all but Nausicaa, who stood her ground, brave and curious, perhaps emboldened by Athena's unseen presence. Odysseus, ever the clever speaker, knew he could not simply rush at her. He spoke to her from a distance, with gentle, respectful words, praising her beauty and asking for help. He did not want to appear as a threat. He was a skilled orator, and his words, even from his exhausted state, were charming. Nausicaa, touched by his words and seeing his humble state, felt pity for him. She was also impressed by his noble bearing, despite his appearance. She called back her maidens and told them to give him clothes and food. "He is a stranger," she said, "and all strangers are sent by Zeus. We must help him." Odysseus, after washing himself in the river and putting on the clothes given to him, appeared even more impressive, as Athena had secretly given him a touch of divine beauty and stature. Nausicaa then instructed him to follow her and her maidens towards the city, but had entered the palace alone after her, to avoid any gossip or awkwardness with her people. She told him to approach her mother, Queen Arete, first, as her favor was important. Odysseus followed her advice. He entered the magnificent palace of King Alcinous and Queen Arete. It was a place of unbelievable luxury, with golden statues, rich tapestries, and feasts always being prepared. He approached Queen Arete first, humbling himself, embracing her knees, and begging for her hospitality and help in getting home. Alcinous and Arete were known for their generosity. They welcomed Odysseus warmly, inviting him to share their feast. After he had eaten and rested, King Alcinous asked him who he was and where he came from. Odysseus, finally in a safe place, began to tell his incredible story, recounting his 10 years of wandering, starting from the very beginning, from the sack of Troy. This long telling of his adventures forms the heart of the Odyssey itself, as he finally reveals the true horrors he has faced. He was a master storyteller, captivating his audience with tales of his trials and triumphs. A magical journey home, the Phaeacian gift. For several days and nights, Odysseus remained in the magnificent palace of King Alcinous and Queen Arete, feasting and telling his incredible story. He recounted every detail of his long and terrible journey. The Cicones, the Lotus-Eaters, the brutal encounter with Polyphemus the Cyclops, the gift of the winds from Aeolus and his men's foolish betrayal, the horror of the Laestrygonians, his year with Circe and the journey to land the dead, and finally his long captivity with Calypso. He left nothing out, and the Phaeacians, renowned for their love of stories, listened in awe and wonder. King Alcinous and Queen Arete were deeply moved by Odysseus' tale of suffering and his strong desire to return home. They were a generous and hospitable people, and they felt great pity for the hero who had endured so much. Alcinous promised Odysseus that they would take him home. He ordered his finest sailors to prepare a ship, a swift and magical vessel known for its speed, built without a rudder, guided only by thought. The Phaeacians, true to their word, loaded the ship with valuable gifts, gold, bronze, and beautiful woven cloths. They treated Odysseus like a king, showering him with riches to make up for his long years of hardship. On the day of departure, Odysseus boarded the ship, carrying his precious gifts. He was tired but deeply grateful. He lay down on a comfortable bed on the ship's deck, covered by a fine rug. For the first time in 20 years, since he first left Ithaca for Troy, Odysseus finally fell into a deep, peaceful sleep, a sleep undisturbed by fear or worry. The Phaeacian sailors were legendary. They rowed through the night, their ship cutting swiftly through the waves, moving with incredible speed. It was as if the ship itself knew the way, guided by divine favor. In just a few hours, while Odysseus slept soundly, they reached the shores of Ithaca. They sailed into a sheltered cove, hidden by a sacred olive tree. Carefully, so as not to wake him, they lifted the sleeping Odysseus from the ship, along with all his gifts. They laid him gently on the sand, placing the treasures in a pile beside him, covered by blankets. Then, without a sound, they turned their ship and sailed away, completing their generous mission. As the Phaeacians sailed back home, Poseidon, who had been watching from his palace beneath the sea, saw their return. He was furious. Not only had they helped his hated enemy Odysseus, but they had done so by carrying him swiftly and safely across his waters, insulting his power. He complained to Zeus, demanding punishment. Zeus, though he liked the Phaeacians, agreed that they had been too bold. As their ship approached their own harbor, Poseidon turned the vessel into stone, rooting it to the seabed, a permanent warning to other mortals who might dare to defy the gods. Back on Ithaca, a land changed. Odysseus awoke, bewildered and confused. He didn't recognize his own island. The olive tree, the rocky cove, the familiar sights were changed, hidden by a mist that Athena had cast around him. He felt heartbroken, believing he had been tricked again, perhaps by the Phaeacians, and dropped on the wrong island. He counted his treasures, fearing they had stolen his gifts. He groaned in despair, wondering if his journey would ever end. Suddenly, a young shepherd boy appeared. This was Athena, disguised as a youth, coming to meet her favorite hero. Odysseus, cautious as always, didn't reveal his true identity. He made up a story, pretending to be a fugitive from Crete who had recently arrived on the island. Athena smiled, then revealed herself in all her divine glory, shining like a goddess. "Foolish man," she laughed but kindly, "you're always full of tricks, even on your own land. It is I, Athena, who has protected you, and this is Ithaca, your home." Odysseus was overjoyed and relieved. He praised Athena, grateful for her help. But he also asked her about the situation in his palace. He knew from Tiresias that his home would be troubled. Athena confirmed his fears. "Your palace is filled with arrogant men," she told him. "Over 100 suitors from all the surrounding islands have moved into your house. They feast on your food, drink your wine, and demand that your wife, Penelope, choose one of them to marry, believing you are dead. They are wasting your wealth and dishonoring your household. Your son, Telemachus, is now a man, but he is helpless against them." Odysseus burned with anger and a fierce desire for revenge. But Athena, ever wise, stopped him. "You cannot reveal yourself yet," she warned. "You must come up with a plan to take them by surprise. First, you must test the loyalty of your household." Athena then magically transformed Odysseus. She touched him with her golden wand, making him instantly appear old and poor. His rich clothes turned into rags, his strong body became shriveled, his hair fell out, and his eyes grew dim. He became a bent and wrinkled beggar, unrecognizable to anyone who knew him. This disguise was perfect. No one would suspect that this old, wretched man was the king of Ithaca. "Go now," Athena instructed him. "Go to the hut of your loyal swineherd, Eumaeus. He is a good man, and he will welcome you. Stay with him, and learn what has been happening in your house. I will go to Sparta to bring your son, Telemachus, home." With these words, Athena flew into the sky, leaving Odysseus alone, disguised as a beggar, on the land he had longed for 20 years. His heart was a mix of joy and deep sorrow. He was home, but it was not the home he had left. It was a kingdom filled with enemies, and his return would demand another, far more personal battle. He made his way toward the hut of Eumaeus, his loyal swineherd, the first step in his secret return. The loyal swineherd, Eumaeus. Odysseus, disguised as an old, ragged beggar, walked along the rocky path toward the hut of his swineherd, Eumaeus. This was a deliberate choice. He needed to find out what was happening in his kingdom without revealing himself, and he needed to test the loyalty of his servants. Eumaeus, he knew, was one of his oldest and most trusted slaves, a man who loved his master deeply. As he approached the hut, Odysseus heard the barking of dogs. Eumaeus kept many dogs to guard his pigs. The dogs rushed at the beggar, snarling viciously. But Eumaeus, hearing the commotion, rushed out of his hut and quickly drove the dogs away with stones, scolding them. "Old stranger," Eumaeus said, his voice kind, "you are lucky my dogs did not tear you to pieces. Come into my hut. Do not fear. It is not right to turn away a stranger, for all beggars and strangers are sent by Zeus." Eumaeus, not recognizing his king, welcomed him with genuine warmth. He led the beggar inside, offering him a seat, spreading a thick pile of brushwood and a deerskin for him to sit on. He roasted some pork for him, mixed wine, and served a simple but hearty meal. He truly treated the beggar as a respected guest, showing true hospitality, a virtue almost forgotten in Odysseus's own palace. As they ate, Odysseus, still in disguise, began to question Eumaeus, trying to learn about his home. He asked about the absent king, about Penelope, and about Telemachus. Eumaeus, heartbroken by the long absence of his master, spoke freely and with deep sorrow. "Ah, old stranger," Eumaeus sighed, "you must be a stranger indeed if you do not know about our king, the great Odysseus. He has been gone for 20 long years, first at Troy, and then lost at sea. All believe him dead, and because of this, our house is filled with greedy men, suitors, who devour our wealth and torment our noble queen, Penelope." Eumaeus spoke of Penelope's unwavering loyalty, how she refused to marry any of the suitors, still hoping for Odysseus's return. He described how the suitors lived in the palace, feasting and demanding, draining the royal treasury. He spoke of young Telemachus, helpless against so many powerful men, unable to protect his mother or his inheritance. Eumaeus' words were filled with pain and loyalty to his lost master. He genuinely mourned Odysseus, believing him to be dead, but still held him in the highest regard. Odysseus, hearing this, felt his heart swell with both anger at the suitors and profound love for Penelope and Eumaeus. He tried to comfort Eumaeus, telling him that Odysseus was still alive and would surely return soon. He even swore an oath, but Eumaeus, having heard many such hopeful but false rumors over the years, did not truly believe him. He thanked the beggar for his kind words, but insisted that Odysseus was surely dead. Odysseus stayed with Eumaeus for several days, learning all the grim details of what had happened in his absence. He saw Eumaeus' unwavering loyalty, his honesty, and his deep love for his absent master. This confirmed that Eumaeus was indeed a trustworthy ally. This quiet period with his loyal swineherd was crucial for Odysseus, allowing him to gather vital information and prepare for his vengeful return to the palace. It was a moment of true human connection, after so many years of monstrous encounters and divine manipulation. The long-awaited reunion, father and son. While Odysseus was hidden with Eumaeus, disguised as a beggar, Athena, true to her word, had flown to Sparta. There, she found Telemachus, Odysseus' son, who had traveled to the palaces of King Menelaus and Queen Helen to seek news of his long-lost father. Telemachus had grown into a young man, brave but still unsure of himself, weighed down by the disrespect of the suitors in his own home. Athena urged him to return to Ithaca quickly, warning him that the suitors were plotting to ambush and kill him on his way back. She gave him advice on how to avoid their trap, and told him to go straight to Eumaeus' hut first. Telemachus sailed swiftly back to Ithaca, avoiding the ambush set by the suitors. He landed safely and, following Athena's instructions, made his way to the hut of the swineherd. Eumaeus was overjoyed to see his young master, embracing him with tears in his eyes, like a father welcoming his son. Odysseus, still disguised as a beggar, watched this touching reunion, his own heart aching to reveal himself, but knowing the time was not yet right. Eumaeus told Telemachus about the beggar he was hosting, speaking highly of his wisdom and his stories. Telemachus, polite and respectful, welcomed the beggar and offered him clothing and passage to the city, not knowing he was speaking to his own father. After Eumaeus left the hut to go to the palace and tell Penelope of Telemachus' safe return, Athena appeared to Odysseus, unseen by Telemachus. She waved her golden wand, and the disguise fell away. Odysseus was instantly transformed back into his true self, a strong, noble king, clean-shaven, with rich clothes and the powerful aura of a hero. Telemachus stared in disbelief. He thought he was seeing a god, or perhaps Eumaeus had brought a madman into the hut. "You are not the beggar I saw before," he exclaimed, shrinking back in awe. Odysseus's eyes filled with tears. "No, my son," he said, "I am your father. After 20 years, I have finally returned to Ithaca." Telemachus could not believe it. He had always dreamed of this moment, but after so long he had lost hope. He thought it was some trick of the gods. But Odysseus, with a gentle smile, explained how Athena had helped him and how he had been disguised. He showed him the scar on his foot, a mark only his closest family would know. Then the floodgates opened. Father and son embraced, weeping tears of joy and relief, holding each other for a long, long time. It was a powerful, emotional reunion, filled with the sorrow of lost years and the overwhelming happiness of finding each other again. Once their tears had subsided, Odysseus and Telemachus began to speak of the dire situation in the palace. Odysseus learned the full extent of the suitors' arrogance and their vast numbers, over 100 strong, plus their servants, all living off his wealth, plotting against Telemachus, and trying to force Penelope to marry one of them. Odysseus, his anger cold and precise, laid out his plan. He would return to the palace, still disguised as a beggar. Telemachus was not to reveal his father's true identity, no matter what. He would have to endure insults and abuse from the suitors, and he would have to watch his father being mistreated, but he must remain silent. Odysseus would watch and learn, identifying who was loyal and who was not. "Tomorrow," Odysseus told his son, "you will go to the city first. I will follow with Eumaeus, still in my beggar's disguise. You must gather all the weapons from the great hall and hide them away, leaving only a few for us. If the suitors ask why, tell them you are storing them away from the smoke, or that you fear the men, drunk with wine, might harm each other." Telemachus readily agreed to the plan. He had grown up without a father, feeling powerless against the suitors, and now, finally, he had his king, his hero, by his side. The reunion filled him with a new strength and purpose. The stage was now set for the most dangerous part of Odysseus' return, infiltrating his own home and confronting the men who had dishonored it for so long. The great reckoning was about to begin. The beggar's journey to the palace. The next morning, Telemachus went to the palace, as instructed, leaving his father behind with Eumaeus. Odysseus, still disguised as the old, wretched beggar, followed later with his loyal swineherd. As they walked towards the city, a harsh encounter awaited them. They met a rude goatherd named Melanthius, who was in charge of the palace goats. Melanthius was a disloyal servant, a friend of the greedy suitors, and a man who had no respect for the old king. As he saw Eumaeus leading the beggar, he began to curse and insult them both. He kicked Odysseus, trying to trip him, and mocked him, saying no decent person would ever welcome such a miserable wretch. Odysseus, controlling his anger, resisted the urge to strike Melanthius down, remembering his promise to Athena and his plan of secrecy. Eumaeus scolded Melanthius, but the goatherd just laughed. This encounter showed Odysseus just how much things had changed in his absence and how many disloyal servants were in his household. As Odysseus and Eumaeus approached the palace gates, an old, tired dog lay on a pile of dung nearby. This was Argus, Odysseus' own hunting dog, whom he had raised as a puppy, but had left behind 20 years ago when he sailed for Troy. Argus was now very old, neglected by the servants, covered in fleas, and barely able to move. But even after 2 decades, after all the changes in his master's appearance and the long years of neglect, Argus sensed his king. He heard Odysseus' voice, recognized his scent, and weakly lifted his head. He tried to wag his tail and whimper with joy, but he was too old and weak. A single tear rolled down Odysseus' cheek as he looked at his loyal dog. He had to turn his face away, pretending not to notice, so Eumaeus wouldn't see his emotion and guess his true identity. He could not risk his disguise. Argus, having finally seen his master again after 20 years of waiting, let out a final soft sigh, and then closed his eyes for the last time. He died, his long wait finally over. It was a heartbreaking moment, a silent testament to the passage of time and the profound loyalty that still existed in his ruined home. Odysseus and Eumaeus entered the palace. The great hall was filled with the sounds of feasting and loud, arrogant laughter. The suitors, over 100 strong, sat around tables, devouring Odysseus's food, drinking his wine, and making themselves at home. Telemachus sat among them, watching, unable to act. Odysseus, still in his beggar's rags, was immediately treated with contempt. He moved from table to table, begging for scraps, testing each suitor's generosity and character as Athena had instructed. Most of the suitors were rude and uncaring. Antinous, the most arrogant and cruel of the suitors, was especially harsh. He mocked Odysseus, calling him a lazy vagabond and refusing to give him any food. He even threw a stool at Odysseus, hitting him on the shoulder. Odysseus endured the pain silently, like a solid rock, his eyes burning with controlled fury. He knew that the time for revenge was coming. Another suitor, Eurymachus, also treated him poorly, insulting him and throwing a footstool at him, though it missed and hit a wine steward instead. Telemachus tried to defend the beggar, but he was still outnumbered and outmatched. Even the palace servants were not all loyal. Odysseus watched them carefully. Some, like the coward Phaeacian and the old nurse Euryclea, still held a deep love for their lost master. Others, like the goatherd Melanthius and some of the female servants, had sided with the suitors, enjoying the easy life and disrespecting Penelope and Telemachus. Odysseus saw the corruption that had spread throughout his household. During these encounters, Odysseus saw firsthand the pride and wastefulness of suitors. They consumed vast amounts of his livestock and wine, treating his home as their own, showing no respect for his family or his property. He understood that they were not just after Penelope's hand. They wanted his wealth, his kingdom, and they would not hesitate to kill Telemachus if he stood in their way. His rage grew cold and steady as he planned his vengeance. Later that evening, after the day's feasting, another beggar, a huge, brawny man named Iris, entered the hall. Iris was a regular beggar of Ithaca, and he didn't like the new competition. He insulted Odysseus, challenging him to a boxing match. The suitors, amused by the prospect of two beggars fighting, egged him on, offering food and wine as a prize. Odysseus, still playing the part of a weak old man, hesitated at first, pretending to be reluctant, but then he slowly pulled up his rags, revealing his strong, muscular thighs and shoulders beneath. Athena had secretly filled him with renewed strength, making him look even more powerful. The suitors stared in surprise. Even Iris began to look nervous. The fight was short. Odysseus struck Iris with a single, powerful blow to the jaw, shattering his bones and knocking him unconscious. He then dragged the defeated beggar outside the courtyard, leaning him against the wall, warning him never to return. The suitors were impressed by the old beggar's strength, but still did not suspect his true identity. This fight showed Odysseus' hidden power and sent a subtle message of warning to the suitors, though they were too arrogant to understand it. The old nurse and the scar. As night fell, and the suitors finally left the great hall to go to their own houses, Odysseus and Telemachus began the next part of their plan. They carefully removed all the weapons from the hall, as Odysseus had instructed earlier. They carried swords, spears, and shields to the storage room, hiding them away. Telemachus told the disloyal servants that he was moving the dusty weapons to keep them safe from the smoke of the hearth. After the weapons were secured, Penelope, looking beautiful but worn from worry, came down from her chambers to speak with the beggar. She had heard about the rude treatment he received from the suitors, and her kind heart felt sympathy for him. She invited him to sit by the fire and asked him about his travels. She felt drawn to him, a strange familiarity in his wise words, though she had no idea it was her husband. Odysseus, still in disguise, told her a long, elaborate, and believable false story. He pretended to be a man from Crete who had met Odysseus many years ago. He spoke of Odysseus's brave deeds, his appearance, and even described the clothes Odysseus had worn the day he left for Troy. Penelope, hearing details that only her husband would know, wept openly, her grief for her lost husband fresh again. It was a painful moment for Odysseus, seeing his beloved wife's sorrow, yet he had to maintain his disguise. Penelope, grateful for his stories and touched by his apparent knowledge of Odysseus, offered him a bath and foot washing, a mark of great hospitality. She called for her oldest and most trusted nurse, Euryclea, a woman who had nursed Odysseus as a baby. Euryclea, a loyal and wise old woman, was reluctant to wash the feet of a stranger, but Penelope insisted. As Euryclea began to wash the beggar's feet, her hands, accustomed to Odysseus's body from his childhood, felt something familiar. She traced a long, jagged scar just above his knee. This scar was from a hunting accident in his youth, a wound he had received from a wild boar during a hunt with his grandfather Autolycus. It was a secret mark, known only to a few, including his parents and Euryclea. In that instant, Euryclea recognized him. Her old eyes, filled with tears of recognition, stared at his face, then back at the scar. She knew. She dropped his foot, and the basin clanged to the floor, spilling water. A gasp escaped her lips, and she looked from the scar to his face, about to cry out his name. Odysseus quickly grabbed her by the throat, his hand firm but gentle. He pulled her close and whispered fiercely in her ear, "Nurse, do not betray me. Do not tell anyone. I am home, but if you speak a word, I will show no mercy when I kill the suitors." Euryclea, trembling but understanding, promised to keep his secret. Her heart was overflowing with joy and relief. Her beloved master was finally home. She quickly composed herself, finished washing his feet, and kept silent. Penelope, lost in her own thoughts and grief, did not notice the dramatic exchange. This moment was crucial. It confirmed Odysseus's identity to one of his most loyal servants and showed his desperate need for secrecy. The tension in the palace was building. He was literally under the same roof as his wife and his enemies, with only a few trusted allies, and his beggar's disguise standing between his return and utter disaster. The stage was set for the final, bloody confrontation. The time for the great reckoning was near. Penelope, weary from the constant pressure of the suitors, and perhaps sensing a faint hope from the beggar's words, decided to set a challenge. She would marry the man who could string Odysseus's great bow and shoot an arrow cleanly through the holes of 12 axe heads lined up in a row. This was an impossible task for any ordinary man. Only Odysseus, with his legendary strength and skill, had ever been able to do it. Penelope, of course, knew this. Perhaps it was a last desperate hope, or a clever way to delay the inevitable. The next morning, the suitors gathered, confident in their strength and their ability to win Penelope's hand. They brought out Odysseus's old bow, a huge, stiff weapon that had been kept in a storage room for 20 years. One by one, they tried to string it. They grunted, strained, and sweated, but none of them, not even the strongest, could even bend the bow enough to string it. Their arrogance turned to frustration and shame. Meanwhile, Odysseus, still disguised as the old beggar, quietly approached his loyal servants, Eumaeus the swineherd and Phaeacian the cowherd. He knew he could trust them. He led them away from the noisy hall and revealed his true identity to them, showing them the scar on his leg. They wept with joy and relief, embracing their long-lost master. Odysseus instructed them. At his signal, Eumaeus was to bring him the bow and close the doors to the women's quarters, locking them tightly. Phaeacian was to lock the outer gated courtyard, trapping all the suitors inside the hall. Back in the hall, after many failed attempts, the leading suitors, Ananus and Eurymachus, grew angry and frustrated. They couldn't even string the bow. It was humiliating. At this point, Odysseus, the beggar, spoke up. "Friends," he said humbly, "allow this old beggar to try. Perhaps my old hands still have some strength, and I can bring you some amusement." The suitors roared with laughter and scorn. "A beggar trying to string the king's bow?" Antinous scoffed. "He's lost his mind." But Telemachus, remembering his father's plan, firmly insisted. "It is my right to allow it," he declared, showing a newfound confidence. Penelope, also present, and perhaps wanted to see if the stranger truly had some connection to her husband, supported the beggar's request. She sensed something in him, a flicker of hope she couldn't explain. Eumaeus then brought the great bow to Odysseus. The suitors watched, still laughing and making jokes. Odysseus took the bow in his hands. He calmly inspected it, testing its balance, as if he had held it just yesterday. Then, with a single, smooth, powerful motion, he strung the bow as easily as a musician strings a lyre. A loud, clear twang echoed through the hall, a sound that made the suitors' faces turn pale. They were stunned. Odysseus then took an arrow from the quiver. He drew the string back, carefully aimed to the holes of the 12 axe heads, and released the arrow. It flew straight and true, passing cleanly through every single axe head, and then buried itself in the wall beyond. A clap of thunder, sent by Zeus, boomed overhead, a sign of divine approval. Odysseus smiled, then looked at his son. "Telemachus," he said, "your guess has not shamed you. Now, it is time for final feast." With that, Odysseus threw off his beggar's rags. He stood tall and powerful in the hall, his face now transformed by Athena back to his true, kingly appearance. He had his bow in hand, a quiver full of arrows at his feet. Telemachus, armed with his own sword, stood by his side. Eumaeus and Phaeacian had locked the doors, trapping the suitors. The great hall, once filled with arrogant laughter, fell silent with a terrible fear. The suitors stared at Odysseus, their faces twisted with disbelief and terror. They were trapped, unarmed, and facing the king they believed to be long dead. The most arrogant suitor, Antinous, was the first to speak, trying to explain away their actions. But Odysseus, his eyes burning with righteous fury, did not hesitate. He aimed an arrow straight at Antinous' throat. The arrow found its mark, piercing Antinous' neck, and he fell backward, choking on his own blood, his table crashing down with him. Chaos erupted in the hall. The suitors screamed in terror, realizing the truth. "It's him! Odysseus is here!" they cried, looking wildly for weapons that were nowhere to be found. The slaughter began. Odysseus, Telemachus, Eumaeus, and Phaeacian fought with deadly precision. Athena, sometimes appearing as a shield in the air or even disguised as Mentor, encouraged them and deflected arrows, showing her divine favor. The suitors, trapped and largely unarmed, tried to fight back with chairs and scattered spears, but they were no match for the furious king and his loyal allies. Odysseus moved like a whirlwind, arrows flying from his bow, each one finding its mark. When his arrows ran out, he grabbed his shield and spear, fighting hand-to-hand, his fury unstoppable. The hall filled with blood and the cries of dying men. Some suitors begged for mercy, but Odysseus, remembering their disrespect, their waste of his home, and their plots against his son, showed none. He was a vengeful king, reclaiming his kingdom. The disloyal goatherd, Melanthius, who had insulted Odysseus earlier, tried to sneak into the storage room to bring weapons for the suitors. But Eumaeus and Phaeacian, loyal to their king, caught him. They tied him up and hung him by his hands from the rafters, leaving him to suffer. The battle raged until every last suitor lay dead, sprawled across the floor amidst the overturned tables and spilled wine. The great hall, once a place of feasting and laughter, was now a scene of gruesome vengeance. After the suitors were killed, Odysseus ordered Euryclea to identify the disloyal female servants, those who had sided with the suitors and dishonored his house. She brought out 12 women, weeping and terrified. Odysseus ordered Telemachus to take them outside and hang them, a harsh but common punishment for such betrayal in ancient times. Melanthius, the disloyal goatherd, was also brought out and put to a terrible death, his nose and ears cut off, his hands and feet chopped off, as punishment for his treachery. Finally, Odysseus ordered the hall to be purified. It was cleaned with fire and sulfur, washing away the blood and the stench of death, symbolically cleansing his home of corruption that had filled it. The slaughter was complete. His home was reclaimed, but the cost had been immense. The joyful reunion with his family could finally begin, but would be a reunion tinged with the horror of what had been done. The queen's final test, Penelope and the bed. While the bloody battle raged in the great hall, Penelope, Odysseus's loyal wife, remained in her chambers upstairs. Euryclea, the old nurse who had recognized Odysseus by a scar, was bursting with joy in the news that her master was finally home. She rushed upstairs to tell Penelope, "Wake up, my dear child." Euryclea cried, shaking Penelope. "Your husband, Odysseus, is home. He is here, and he's killed all the wicked suitors." Penelope, who had suffered for 20 years, constantly hoping and constantly disappointed by false rumors, could not believe it. She thought the old nurse had gone mad with joy. "My dear nurse," Penelope said, "the gods have driven you crazy. How can Odysseus be home? He is dead. This must be a trick, or perhaps one of the gods has killed the suitors for their wickedness." Euryclea insisted, "No, it is truly him. He is the beggar you spoke with. I saw his scar, the one he got from the boar hunt." Still, Penelope was hesitant. After so many years of longing and false hope, she was afraid to believe it, afraid to be hurt again. She went downstairs to the great hall, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and hope. She saw Odysseus, no longer a beggar, but a strong, kingly figure, sitting by the fire, covered in the blood of the suitors. Telemachus watched them both, waiting. Odysseus, understanding his wife's doubt, was not offended. He knew she had to be sure. He was still dirty from battle, and Penelope, still wary, did not rush to embrace him. She sat across from him in silence, staring, trying to make sense of what she saw. Telemachus grew frustrated. "Mother," he said, "how can you be so cold? Why do you not welcome father?" But Odysseus, calm and wise, silenced his son. "Let her test me, Telemachus," he said. "She has suffered much, and she needs proof." Then Odysseus told Euryclea to prepare a bed for him outside his private chamber, saying that his wife was too stubborn to accept him. Penelope, hearing this, saw a chance to give her final, secret test. "Euryclea," Penelope commanded, "move my master's bed outside his well-built bedroom, the one he built himself. Take it out and spread it with bedding." Odysseus, hearing these words, leaped up in sudden anger and surprise. He knew that their marriage bed was carved directly from the trunk of a living olive tree, rooted deep in the ground inside their chamber. It was impossible to move. Only he, Penelope, and one faithful servant knew the secret. "Woman," Odysseus exclaimed, his voice filled with a mixture of shock and emotion, "who has moved my bed? That is impossible. I built that bed myself. I carved it from the trunk of a living olive tree, which grew within this very house. I built the chamber walls around it. No man could ever move that bed." As he spoke, he described in great detail how he had built the bed from the olive tree, never cutting it down, but building their bedroom around it. He described its unique and unmovable nature. Penelope, hearing these words, the secret known only to them, finally knew for certain. Her doubts vanished. This was truly her Odysseus. No one else could have known such a private, unique detail about their bed, the very symbol of their marriage and home. Tears streamed down her face, not of sorrow, but of overwhelming joy and relief. She rushed to him, throwing her arms around his neck, kissing him, holding him tightly, weeping as if she would never let go. "Odysseus," she cried, "forgive me. The gods have afflicted me with so much sorrow, with fear of tricksters. But now I know it is truly you." They held each other for a long time, reunited after 20 long years of separation, grief, and longing. It was a reunion filled with love, tears, and a deep, quiet understanding. Athena, watching from afar, was pleased. She even made the night longer, holding back the dawn, so that Odysseus and Penelope could share their stories and their love for a full night, finally at peace in their home. Reunion with Laertes, healing old wounds. After his joyful and emotional reunion with Penelope, Odysseus knew there was one more crucial reunion to be made, with his elderly father Laertes. He wanted to break the news gently, after all the trauma of the suitor slaughter. The next morning, Odysseus, Telemachus, Eumaeus, and Phaeacius left the palace. Odysseus instructed Penelope to remain in her chambers with her loyal women, and not to go out into the city, as there would surely be anger and cries for revenge from the suitors' families. He also told his son to bring fresh clothes for himself and his loyal servants. Then, with Athena's guidance, they made their way to Laertes' farm. The old king, once so strong and proud, was now withered by age and grief. He lived a simple life in a small hut, working in his vineyards, constantly mourning for his lost son. He wore old, patched clothes, his hair was thin and white, and his spirit was broken by sorrow. He refused to live in the palace, unable to bear the presence of the greedy suitors. Odysseus' heart ached at the sight of his father. He loved Laertes deeply, and seeing him in such a state of despair was almost as painful as his own long wanderings. Just as he had done with Eumaeus and Penelope, Odysseus decided to test his father first, to see his reaction, and perhaps to prepare him for the overwhelming truth. He approached Laertes, still disguised as a stranger, a traveler who claimed to have known Odysseus long ago. He spoke to Laertes about the lost king, asking about his son, pretending he was merely a friend of Odysseus, seeking news. Laertes, hearing the name of his beloved son, immediately broke down. He wept openly, grabbing handfuls of dust and scattering them over his head, a sign of deep mourning. He told the stranger about his endless grief for Odysseus, how his son had gone to war and never returned, and how his family was now being ruined by the suitors. He spoke of his wife Anaclea, who had died of a broken heart. He even offered the stranger hospitality, despite his own poverty. Odysseus could not bear it any longer. Seeing his father's profound sorrow, his heart twisted with pain. The disguise was too cruel. Tears streamed down his face. He revealed himself, embracing his father. "Father," he cried, "it is I, your son, Odysseus. I have returned." Laertes, like Penelope, could not believe it. He had waited 20 years for this moment, but after so much suffering, he feared it was a cruel trick, a god playing games with his grief. "Show me a sign." Laertes pleaded. "Show me something only my son would know." Odysseus immediately showed him the scar on his leg, the same boar hunt scar that Euryclea had recognized. Then he spoke of the fruit trees in Laertes' own orchard, trees that Laertes had given him when he was a small boy, telling him the exact number of each type of fruit tree. No stranger, no impostor, could possibly know such details. Laertes finally believed. With a cry of pure joy, he embraced his son, clinging to him tightly, overcome with relief and happiness. The old man, filled with new life, felt his strength return. Athena, watching over them, touched Laertes with her magic, making him appear younger, stronger, and more kingly, ready for battle ahead. This reunion was a powerful healing, bringing closure to years of agonizing uncertainty for Laertes. It was a reminder that even after so much loss and pain, love and family ties remained unbreakable. Odysseus now had his son, his wife, and his father, all united and ready to face the world. But their peace was still fragile. The families of the dead suitors were about to demand their revenge, and the final test of Odysseus' return was yet to come. The final test, restoring peace in Ithaca. The peace in Ithaca was short-lived as expected. News of the suitors' slaughter quickly spread through the city. The families of the dead men, filled with grief and rage, gathered in the marketplace. They cried out for revenge, demanding justice for their sons and brothers. Eupates, the father of Antinous, the first suitor killed by Odysseus, was especially vocal, stirring up the crowd and urging them to attack Odysseus and his household. He wanted blood for blood. The citizens of Ithaca were divided. Some were angry at the suitors, knowing how much trouble they had caused and how they had disrespected Odysseus' household. Others, especially the families of the dead suitors, felt that Odysseus had committed a great wrong by killing so many noblemen, even if they were in his home. They raised their weapons, ready for a fight, believing that Odysseus deserved to die for his actions. As the angry crowd, led by Eupates, marched towards Odysseus' palace, the king, along with Telemachus, Laertes, Eumaeus, and Phaeacius, prepared for yet another battle. They armed themselves, ready to defend their home and their hard-won peace. Even the old Laertes, his strength renewed by Athena, put on his armor, eager to fight alongside his son and grandson. But high on Mount Olympus, the gods were watching. Athena, seeing the impending bloodshed and wanting to prevent further civil war in Ithaca, pleaded with Zeus once more. She argued that enough blood had been spilled and that it was time to bring lasting peace to Odysseus' kingdom. Zeus, agreeing with his daughter, allowed Athena to intervene. Athena descended to Ithaca, appearing to both sides. Sometimes she appeared as a wise old man, mentor, one of Odysseus' old friends and trusted advisors, whom Athena often disguised herself as earlier in the story to help Telemachus. At other times, She appeared in her full divine glory, a shimmering presence on the battlefield. She spoke with a voice of authority, commanding the angry families to lay down their arms and accept a peaceful resolution. As the two groups clashed, Athena, disguised as Mentor, stood before them. She called out, "Men of Ithaca, stop this hateful war. Let us make peace, and let Odysseus be your king once more." She even encouraged Laertes, helping him throw a spear that killed Eupedes, thus removing the leader of the vengeful mob. Then Athena revealed her true divine form, a blinding flash of light, and a terrible fear fell upon the people. They immediately recognized the goddess. Her divine presence caused them to drop their weapons and scatter, fleeing from her power. Odysseus, still ready to fight, was about to pursue them and kill more men, but Athena, with a stern command, stopped him. "Son of Laertes, wise Odysseus," she said, "hold back your hand. Stop this quarrel, lest Zeus be angry with you." Odysseus, recognizing the direct command of a goddess and the will of Zeus, finally lowered his weapon. The fighting stopped. Athena, with Zeus's blessing, then established a lasting peace between Odysseus and the families of the suitors. She made both sides swear oaths to forget the past bloodshed, to live together in harmony, and to accept Odysseus as their rightful king. Justice had been served, but mercy and peace now prevailed. Ithaca, after 20 long years of absence and suffering, finally had its king back, and its people were at peace. Odysseus's final destiny, the fulfillment of Tiresias's prophecy. With peace restored in Ithaca and his kingdom safe, Odysseus was finally able to live out his days as king, ruling wisely alongside Penelope and Telemachus. He had faced countless monsters, powerful gods, and the ultimate test of human endurance. He had reclaimed his home and his family. But there was one last part of Tiresias's prophecy from the Underworld that remained unfulfilled. Tiresias had told Odysseus that to finally make peace with Poseidon, the angry god of the sea, he would have to make one last journey. He was to carry an oar on his shoulder and travel inland, away from the sea, until he reached a place where people knew nothing of the ocean. He would know he was in the right place when someone, seeing his oar, would mistake it for a winnowing fan, a tool used by farmers to separate grain from chaff. In that place, far from the sea, he was to plant his oar in the ground and make a rich sacrifice to Poseidon. Only then would the sea god finally forgive him, and Odysseus would find a peaceful death in his old age, far from the restless waves that had tormented him for so long. Odysseus, a man of his word, knew he had complete this final task. Though he was now old and content in Ithaca, he prepared for this last, quiet journey. He bid farewell to Penelope and Telemachus, knowing this would be his last great adventure. He set off, carrying an oar on his shoulder, walking inland, further and further from the familiar salt spray of the sea. He walked for many days, crossing mountains and plains, meeting people who lived simple lives, far from the coastal towns he knew. He spoke with farmers and shepherds, seeing new ways of life. Finally, he arrived in a distant land. As he rested, still carrying his oar, a local farmer approached him. The farmer looked curiously at the long wooden object on Odysseus' shoulder. "Stranger," the farmer asked, "why are you carrying that winnowing fan on your shoulder?" Odysseus smiled. This was a sign. This was the place Tiresias had spoken of. Here, where the sea was so unknown that an oar was mistaken for a farm tool, he would finally find peace. He thanked the farmer, and then, with a solemn heart, he planted his oar in the fertile ground. He built an altar and made a grand sacrifice to Poseidon, offering bull, ram, and boar as Tiresias had instructed. He prayed for the gods' forgiveness, for an end to his long torment by the sea. After this final, sacred act, Odysseus returned to Ithaca. He lived out the rest of his long life in peace, a wise and respected king. He ruled his kingdom justly, watching his son Telemachus grow into a strong leader, and living happily with his faithful Penelope. He had many more children and grandchildren, and his family line continued to prosper. Finally, in his old age, just as Tiresias had foretold, a gentle death came for Odysseus, not from the sea, not from war, but quietly, like a mist, in his sleep. He passed away peacefully, surrounded by his loved ones, his long and incredible journey finally and end. His story, however, lived on, echoing through time. Odysseus became the ultimate symbol of the resourceful hero, the cunning survivor, the man who faced impossible odds and never gave up on his dream of home. His journey teaches us about resilience, the power of loyalty, the dangers of pride, and the unbreakable human spirit that yearns for return no matter how far the path may lead. He may have been the wanderer, but in the end, he was always the homecomer. Odysseus, the wily king of Ithaca, embarked on a journey that defied every expectation a hero. He wasn't the strongest or the fastest, but his wit, his enduring spirit, and his fierce love for home carried him through trials that would break any other man. From the ashes of Troy, through the seductive songs of sirens, the monstrous jaws of Scylla, and the endless longing on Calypso's island, he lost everything but his life and his unwavering desire to return. His story is a powerful reminder that the greatest battles are often fought not with swords and shields, but with courage of heart and cleverness of mind. It teaches us about the temptations we face, the loyalty we find, and the ultimate triumph of perseverance. Odysseus' journey home wasn't just a physical one. It was a journey of self-discovery, of humility, and of reclaiming all that truly mattered. And so, the tale of Odysseus, the wanderer and the homecomer, echoes through time, a timeless epic that reminds us that even after the longest and most difficult voyages, there is always hope for return and the enduring comfort of home.